G'day podcasters, welcome back to Season 6 of True Blue Conversations with your host Adam Bloom, the author of Easy Target, now available at adambloom.com.au. 8 years ago, after returning from 3 tours of Afghanistan and then gaining experience and education in financial planning, Warren Loudon teamed up with fellow veteran Dave Vaughan and started Loudon and Vaughan Private Wealth, founded with the underlying belief that every person matters and every dollar counts, providing comprehensive tailored financial advice and wealth management services for you and your family. Loudon and Vaughan will guide you towards your financial goals with integrity and transparency. Whether you're planning for retirement, investing for the future, or managing your family's wealth, they've got you covered. Visit loudonandvaughan.com.au or call 02 9538 2704 to book a meeting with Warren today.
G'day, welcome back to True Blue Conversations. I'm Adam Bloom. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, a good mate of mine who now lives in the USA, where he resides, and he's got one hell of a story. He served in the 2nd Commando Regiment for 12 years, deployed multiple times all around the world, and he's joined us today to share his story and talk about his deployments overseas and his transition away from defense and what he does now. So I'm absolutely honored to have him on. Andy Steele, thanks for joining us, mate, on the podcast.
Adam, it's a privilege. Thanks for having me.
Mate, it's an absolute honor and a privilege, mate, to have you on. So, mate, before we get into your military career, let's go back to a young Andy. Can you tell us a little bit about you growing up? What were you like at school? Do you have any brothers and sisters? And, yeah, tell us a little bit before we crack into your military side of things.
Yeah. Traditional, 80s family. I was born in 1982 in Brisbane, Vegas. Shout out to everyone there in Brisbane. Had a good younger infancy growing up around Brisbane. From what I remember, we moved to Canada. My dad was a school teacher, and he took an exchange to Canada, British Columbia, to a town called Courtenay on Vancouver Island. So that's kind of where my memory starts to take fruition, I guess. Enjoyed that, at that 3-year-old level age. Came back to Brisbane, and then my dad was very similar to me. I guess he kind of passed that on, very adventurous. He took his career out into the outback, into Western Queensland. So from there, we moved out into Longreach, which is way up there, far west of Rockhampton. So did a couple of years up there. Moved down to a place called St. George, which is about 3 hours west of Toowoomba for a few years. So for me as a young kid out in the bush with all that freedom, I loved it. Very adventurous, very energetic. I have 2 sisters, one 3 years older, one 7 years younger, so I was flat bang in the middle. And I was always the one that was kind of antagonizing between the two of them. We had a good relationship and still do. Very outdoorsy. Loved, doing things with my hands at a young age. And once I was outside, I was in my element.
So for you, I mentioned that you joined the military, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But did you have any family members that had served in the military before you, or were you the first?
So the answer to that is there was a good lineage prior to me on both sides of the family. First and foremost, my dad, he was a NASHO, so he was conscripted, I think in like maybe 1969, 70, and he did a tour of Vietnam. Uh, Prior to him, his father, so my grandfather, he was involved in World War II. I don't know whether he actually deployed. If he did, it was only a short tenure to Papua New Guinea, which he didn't really give me too much juice about because I think it might have been a little bit raw. However, he did, either whether it was through him or through my grandmother and my dad, he was a jungle warfare instructor at Canungra. And he had also some stories, whether it was through him or through my grandmother, that he was involved with the POWs of the Japanese that did a lot of the labour out in New South Wales. At what capacity, I don't know, but I know that he had some sort of involvement with that. And then his father, so my grandfather's father, he was he was part of the merchant marines that was involved in that conflict with World War One. And then on my mother's side, my great grandfather, he was an intel officer in World War One, and I think he worked over in Europe. I didn't really get too much off the cut on that one, but I know that he was involved. So there was some pretty decent history with military service prior to me.
So your dad, he was conscripted and did Nashos. As a young fella, did he talk to you much about his time in Vietnam, or it wasn't until you joined the military that he opened up to you?
When I was younger, the individualized kind of piece was, I want to say, restricted. However, the culture and the honor that should be deserved, and probably, I want to say, an obligation to our Australian servicemen and women, was very heavily pressed upon me, especially around Anzac days, whether there were any friends, anyone that went to church, if there was any aura or, essence in the air that someone was a service person, he would definitely push it on me to have like the utmost respect for them. But when it comes down to his experiences, lessons learned, any stories surrounded with his service in Vietnam, it was very limited. And even to this day, he is very, very tight-lipped about it. I thought I would have got a bit more juice out of him after, I'd come back from some of the stuff that I did, but again, still very, very restricted.
It's funny that, mate, because, well, it's not funny, but it's interesting you say that because, as you know, the Vietnam War was such a controversial war, and it was, the way that the Vietnam vets were treated. I understand that because I've only ever had one Vietnam veteran on the podcast, and a lot of them just won't open up, mate. The way they were treated, they just put it, they were told, forget it and just get on with. And it's a real shame because that's a piece that we're missing, and I really think, hopefully I see things are slowly changing in the respect that I see that you guys, modern day veterans, have now compared to what the Vietnam veterans got. I'm glad we've gone away from the way that we were so controversial back in the 60s towards the Vietnam, like your dad and all the other Vietnam veterans. I'm really glad that we've shifted and it wasn't brought forward
Yeah.
to you guys as well, because otherwise, like, we're proud of what you guys have done for us. Like, it's, a modern day veteran. And I really do feel sorry for your dad's generation because they put the uniform on, mate. They risked their lives, and 523 soldiers made that ultimate sacrifice during that war.
Yeah. And I think it's only through my willingness to dig in those reasons through history and just the political climate over the last 50, 60 years since that. And even here in the US, if the atmospherics are right, I'll I'll do my most effort to acknowledge, whether it's at the grocery store, down getting a 6-pack of beer, whatever the case, and you see one of the old timers with a Vietnam vet hat on, I'll pull them up and say, hey, listen, I want you to know that some of us get it and that we do appreciate what you did. And, from the 4 or 5 that I can think of just in the top of my head now, you can tell these gentlemen, they truly appreciate it. And to the point where you can see that, the tears are starting to dwell in the eyes, and you can tell that it actually matters. And I know that you probably agree. It's just so unfortunate that they've had to experience so much of that period of their life without that acknowledgement.
Absolutely, mate. No, I 100% agree. And I want to ask you that, Andy, because, living over there in the US, there just seems to and from what I've been told for guys that have been over there or veterans, they just seem to do it better than what we do. Like, not better, but it's a different. Being a veteran it has a different meaning over there compared to Australia. What do you think that is, mate? And why do you think it's different from the US to Australia?
Mate, and I just want to be upfront. This is my perspective from the world according to Andy, and speaking from a perspective being an expat, living half my life up till now in Australia and living half close to in America. I put it down to the impact of actually the ground fighting conflicts that America had to endure to fight for this land, which then was intensified with a civil conflict, with the Civil War, and how much blood was shed for that. And then as we fast forward through 1, 2, Vietnam, Korea, all those sort of pieces. But then, specifically Pearl Harbor, I think, when someone punches in the throat like that, the patriotism and the closeness and the willingness for people to just drop down their pitchforks, their tools in the metal shop, whether it be the chalk on the whiteboard as teachers, whatever the case may be, these cats actually stopped what they were doing and said, all right, it's time to huddle in and let's go hit it where it really matters. And then to intensify that to, what we in our generation have experienced firsthand, September 11, same thing, mate. Like and I feel confident that I can say this because I feel like I want to say that I've earned the participation to say it through fighting for our freedoms. It really hurt them, and it hurt us. And it doesn't matter how much we feel for them, we didn't really feel the genuine impact of that. Yeah, we had the Bali bombings of 200 and plus that hit us pretty hard. But when you get 2.5 people killed, within a matter of hours, that patriotism, and for people that are willing to just stand up and go and take the fight to the enemy, for the people that do it, there's that level of understanding and acknowledgement. But then for those people that, whether it be not willing or incapable of taking the fight, the amount of respect, and I think it's the education too, mate. Like, I don't want to get turned into too much of a political piece, especially now with it starting to fall that way here in the States as well. But I think the generational conversations over here are a little bit more to the point, where people are telling their kids, hey, this ain't free, man. Like, people had to earn this. And this wasn't, through dollars and cents. This was through flesh and bone and blood that you stand here comfortably. So I think that's where the difference is. And I'm hoping, Australia can start to acknowledge that through, discussions and conversations that people have like this, whether it be here on these platforms or just between each other and with their kids and their relations and their neighbours and whatever else. So,
Absolutely, mate. No, I think, and it's I wanted to touch on that, mate, because I wanted to get your perspective because it's a unique perspective if you live over there and you live in the States. So it's a really great piece that I wanted to capture because it is. I've heard so much about how the veterans are treated in America, and you're over there. So I just really wanted to capture that piece. But mate, let's go back to, so you mentioned your dad and you've got a rich military history. Was that one of the main draw cards for you to join the military in 1999?
Um, I think when that stuff was getting influenced to me, I really wasn't at that point focused on the military. I was focused on the admiration, the respect, and the prestige of those who had given us our freedoms in Australia. I mean, when I was younger, I was still focused on just playing silly buggers and relying on my athletic ability to kind of take me somewhere into my adulthood. So the answer to that is no. It was a little bit later on.
Yeah, right. Okay. And so you joined up 1999. We were, and that was the year, mate, that we went to East Timor. So that was the first time that we went. Well, there was other deployments, so Bougainville and some sorry, not Bougainville, Somalia. But we were a sort of peacetime army at that point, mate. And so you join up in 1999 and talk me through that process, mate, because the internet wasn't really around then. How did you join? What, 1901 or walk into a recruitment office? What
Yeah.
happened?
Yeah. So kind of just tailing off that last buy-in, it was the whole athletic career, deteriorated pretty quickly. Did I have the skill set? Sure. Did I have the motivation? Maybe. There was an anecdote of some injury in there, and that's not the main story here. But that wasn't where my destiny was, to put it plainly. With that said, rugby is what I'm talking about. My dad was a bit of a rugby head, and he saw the skill and the motivation and the focus that took me to where I wanted. Teasing that um, Queensland potential Australian schoolboy level. So it was there. That injury kind of put me on a different trajectory, and he was still like saying, "Hey, there could be an opportunity here for you. You're 16 and a half, 17. I was in the army, when I was in a peacetime army, and heard from other guys talk about that. A lot of the army back then was a lot around about sport. So he was like, you can go in, you go whatever corps you want, and Thursday 40s is a pretty big deal. Rugby's a pretty big deal in the Australian Army. You're pretty much going to be an amateur athlete. You'll tour around, you'll go overseas, you play the Kiwis, you play the geezers over in the UK. You're going to get some time offshore to play rugby, and be suitably uh, compensated, and you'll always have a meal and somewhere to lay your head. So maybe you want to antagonise that for a couple of years. So that was kind of okay, maybe there is a chance that I can still work on my pursuit of being an athlete, playing rugby in the world arena, and go and serve my country at whatever capacity that means in peacetime army. So that kind of antagonised a bit of bandwidth on army. So with that said, early 12th grade, I just started to, pay a little bit more attention to the newspapers and, the world's atmospherics. Here we are, we're starting to focus on some of the concerns that we had in our region, specifically East Timor, and watching that, on the 6 o'clock news, seeing that there's some stuff going on there. And like I said, looking at the newspapers, there was an article about a commando capability being stood up around that 97 era. and there was a bit of a rant about that, and I was like, that looks pretty good. We've got these cats that are fit, like-minded, jumping their airplanes, playing with boats, shooting stuff, and doing raids, and in time to get home to, flick the television on to watch the rugby sevens or whatever the case may be. I'm like, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. In addition to the East Timor kicking off, I was like, okay. If I was going to do something in the military, here we are. This could be something that maybe, for a young fella like me, pretty, clueless, to put it plainly, this could be my Vietnam. This might be a good place to start. So with that said, yeah, I wandered past the recruiting office downtown Brisbane after school one day and just made some inquiries. And yeah, the next thing I know, I've been psychologically tested. I've done my aptitude testing. I've done my PT test out at Enogra. And they thought it was pretty funny that we've got this young kid. He hasn't had a sniff of freaking beer. He hasn't touched the hooter. Is this guy serious? And it's like, yeah, I'm pretty straight nosed and pretty focused. So after they went through the cycle, I was like, this guy must be pretty fair income. He's a bit of a straight shooter. He's either lying to us and pretty good at it, or he isn't. Let's give him a shot. So fast forward, November of 1999, I'd been sent the letter home saying, yeah, you're admitted to the Australian Army. Head on down to the recruiting office on December 7th. You'll be, given the oath, and you'll be sent on your way down to the recruit training center. So yeah, with all that said, mate, as soon as I got that letter, I kind of kept it pretty hush hush. Obviously, my family knew. I don't know whether they knew how serious I was about it, but I was kind of doing things on my own, checking the mailbox, just being pretty autonomous as it was. So kind of giving them those last-hand bits of information of like, hey, I've got an appointment down at the Defence Force office. So I'm going to take care of business, and that happening with my mates at school. I really didn't tell them what was going on. You had those conversations like, what are you going to do? You're going to go to uni. You're going to, go and get a job down at Red Rooster. You're going to, go and, I don't know, freaking just be a pissant somewhere doing nothing. And I was like, I'm just, looking at my options, because I really didn't want to tell people what I was going to do and not follow through with it.
Mm.
So with all that said, didn't go to my graduation. Went to schoolies for about 2 days, I think. And woke up one morning and said, hey, I'll catch you later, everyone. I'm going to join the army. And, everyone was probably a little bit sideways at that point in time and thought either one, they didn't remember, or two, the guys, probably had a little bit too much to drink. We'll probably see him a couple of hours. But no, they didn't see me for about 6 months. So fast forward all that, yeah. On the bus or on the plane to Kapuka, bussed out to Kapuka, and yeah, there I was. Minute one, Kapuka.
So we'll talk about that, mate, and we'll talk about your time at Kapuka. But I just want to touch on a date, mate, that you mentioned, the 7th of December. Well, back in 1941, that was, Pearl Harbor, mate. So a pretty significant day to, like sign on that dotted line and swear your oath. Like that's a pretty significant date, mate. In everyone sort of knows there's significant dates, especially in the military, that people remember. And we'll get into 9/11 being the catalyst for what would happen in your career going forward. But let's talk about Kapuka, mate. Let's talk about your time. Was it, because how old were you at that point, mate, when you got to Kapuka? 17?
I was 17. I was a young 17-year-old.
So
July is my birthday. So I turned 17 in July of 1999. So, I was, 17 and a half at best.
So talk me through that, mate. Was it when you got to Kapuka, you get off the bus and mate, I've heard stories. Was it shock and awe? Like, holy crap, what, like, I'm in a man's world now. Like this is, I'm still a kid. Talk me through your time at Kapuka and what you remember and what was the toughest part and what did you learn about yourself?
Yeah. So driving out there, I remember getting off the plane. Everyone's kind of in the same kind of mindset, off to a big adventure. Mixed bag. You've got older people. Majority, I remember I was the youngest, so I was, a younger team player in a lot of the football teams that I'd played in. So it wasn't uncommon for me to be on a plane, on a bus with teammates that were older than I am. So that wasn't really an unusual element. When I got off the bus at Kapuka, at night, what time it was, I don't know. It was a period of darkness, but that right there was the blindsided throat punch to this is the big boys league. And like you said, it was the shock of capture. I don't know whether I had mentally prepared for this. I don't know what I'm in for. Uh, let's strap up and fake it until you make it type mindset. So one of the big things that I remember is, I did a bit of research before I joined the army, but I didn't really take into consideration that I'd have to wear boots. And that thing wasn't really a big thing for me. Like I was used to wearing, either football boots or running shoes or flip flops. So wearing these boots was a bit of a killer, and that was something that teach me a lesson on my feet. So I do remember that. Um, I did love the attention to detail. It was like finally I'm in an environment where people actually enjoy the same stuff I did. I was individually diagnosed with ADHD, OCD as a young kid. I'm kind of like not the rest of these schools in the class. Like use me or lose me. Either tell me something in class that's useful, and once I get it, like give me something else, or I'm gonna climb out this window and find something else to do. So finally, I was in an environment where there was enough thrown at me to keep me interested. So that was one of the things that I did get into and really enjoy. Um, the 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 teamwork I loved. I wasn't not used to that. The timings, the the meals were great. It was like I didn't expect to be fed so much. But yeah, that was good. But one of the other things that I do remember is I thought that they would have given us some sort of grace of the flicking from 1909 to the year 2000, where they'd give us a night off or whatever. No, it was business as usual. I think we were out on our field exercise, and it was like it's time to go to bed. And the next thing you know, and it was just before the sun coming up, and it was like, okay, well, welcome everyone. It's the year 2000. So that's what I remember of Kapuka.
And mate, I know a lot of guys and girls I've spoken to when they go to Kapuka, you learn to eat fast. So do you still eat fast, mate, or have you learned to eat normally now?
I mean, especially that we talk about transition. Yeah, if you go down and get a feed down at the local restaurant, you are throwing that food in. You know, my missus tells me that I'm like a vacuum. You just suck that stuff in and you're ready to go do something else. So yeah, you learn how to eat fast.
Yeah,
That's
mate, I
what,
know because I went out last weekend. I went out with my best friend, and she's in the army as well. She's just getting out after 20 years, and we went out for breakfast, mate. And I could tell that she's been in the army because she just like here I am eating nice and slow, mate, gone like just like and I'm just like, yeah, you can tell you've been in the army because there's nothing left.
right. Well, and it's like they don't say this to you, but this is just one of those lessons learned that I've kind of created in my own mind. it's just a task. It's like taking out the trash. It's something that needs to be done. There's no need to take your time doing it. Like I need this to be accomplished in order for me to get on to my next task. And it's
100%.
hard to take that away from someone once they've been indoctrinated to do it.
100%, mate. And so you march out. Did the family come down to see you march out from Kapuga?
Yep. Yeah, they did. My old man came down, my grandma came down, my two sisters came down. So that was to me a highlight. I did the 45-day package, which was a little bit unusual, but that was strictly, that strategic focus by defence to up-arm the defence force with the contribution to East Timor. So, what that breaks down into weeks, I think it's like 6 weeks or something, 6 weeks and change. Like, to me, like, it was super fast. And it didn't really feel like I had changed because I was there in the moment, but the response by my family, as soon as they saw me, you need a little march out, parade, everything's very coordinated and very militarized. And, as soon as it became a little bit less formal and you could, sit down and start having a chat, they're like, you're a different person. You are not a 17-year-old pain in our backside. You are a soldier. And to hear that, like, I didn't really feel like I'd received any of the accolades from the military, but to hear that from, people that have seen me, as a child, to hear that, like, I was like, okay, like, whatever I did, whether I was faking it or whether it's actually stuck, people are actually starting to believe it. And these people that know who I am, I've actually got them fooled too. So that's what I remember from the end of Kapuga.
And well, I guess, mate, you as you say, that you become indoctrinated. They've broken you down. They've built you up the way they want you, and that was only going to keep progressing going forward in your career. But you've got purpose now, mate. Your mindset is different to other 17-year-old kids that are kids, mate. As you say, you're a soldier now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the things. Like, and that's an interesting statement that you make at that point in time. As the youngest in my platoon and sister platoon at that time, I was the youngest, so I'd kind of forgotten about my age. I was just a peer. So later on down the track, I guess I'll make a comment on that when I do enter the real world. There's a huge difference on how I see the rest of the universe.
Absolutely. And mate, so you finish your time, you march out, proud moment, as you've said. You go to initial employment training, mate, and you went infantry and you go up to Singleton. Mate, what was that? If you thought Kapuka was shock and awe, what was Singleton like?
Yeah, it was very similar, and I know that you and all the listeners, whether you're military or not, can understand this. It was like going from primary school to high school. You're around, the tuck shop thinking that you're killing it. You might have, school or sports captain bars on your PT shirt. You're kind of a big deal when you march out of Kapuka with your gold tabs. And then when you get to Singo, you're week one, day one, kindergarten. You're just one of the vermin that know nothing. So that was that stigma again. Like, oh yeah, I've got to earn my place again. That's what I remember with that. The tempo kind of kicked up again a notch. More like-minded. You had in Kapuka All Corps. Now you've got focused infantry punters that want to, be the guys that get the work done in the trenches. So there was that. Okay, now I'm really working with the pedigree that are wanting to do the hard work. However, yes, they are like-minded, but a lot of these guys are either early 20s to late 20s, and I'm yet again, the youngest kid on the block. So that's one of the things I remember, making sure that my maturity reflected theirs. So there was some catch-up work on that I remember. And a lot of it, like I said, was fake it till you make it. Another very compressed series. This was another 45-day accelerated course, again, for that East Timor bolster up of the defence. So it was a lot of work done in a short period of time. And I think they just cut out like those critical pieces and then bolted on those pieces that they'd cut off from infantry school to the battalion that you went to. And we can kind of dig into that later on. But the big part that I remember from Singo was, this is what, again, one of those things where I didn't look in any of the books that I read or any of the brochures for the Defence Force, and I'm sure this was by design, but that's where I got my going feral tabs, where as an infantryman, you need to get comfortable being uncomfortable, and you will get good at going feral. So that was where it went from, you might be kicking dirt for about 3 days at Kapuka out bush without a shower. When you go to Singo, no, we're going to up the ante. You're going to be doing at least 10 days in the field without a shower and, dealing with swamp pass and everything else in between, and making sure that you're doing it with a smile on your face. So that's what I remember of Singo, just being a filthy mongrel and being good at it.
Like you say, mate, you're building your resilience and your problem solving. As you say, mate, if you're surrounded by guys that are older than you, it's going to bring you up in your maturity, and you're gonna progress and develop a lot quicker in the environment that you're around. You're around older guys, and that would have helped you going forward in your career. And so you finish your time at Singleton, and did you at that point, mate? Did you have a preference of where you could go? Like, was it like you could go to 1, 2, 3? Where, like, did you have a preference, or was it not? You're going like you were just given this is where you're going.
Right. It was. I know that 3RAR, because let me trace my steps back. When I joined the army, I was like, yep, I want to be one of those dudes that jump out of a plane. So within the time of that, me saying that and me fast forwarding through to the end of mid-Singleton period, I kind of got to know some of the lingo, and I heard, okay, so 3RR are the paras. Sweet. That's where I want to go. I did have that in the back of my mind based on that article of 4RR Commando. And I think when the preferences came out, it was like, guys, you can put your preferences on there, but, we're just going to be black and white with you. The Army's going to send you where they want you, where they need you. So you can waste ink telling them where you want to go. You're going to go where they need you. So with all that said, you can fill in the gaps between that. I went to 4RR, and I was like, hey, giddy up. Let's do jump out of planes too. Maybe I'll get, I killed 2 birds with 1 stone. So the short answer with that is I wanted to go to 3. I went to 4, which is just across the street back then. They jump out of planes too. So it's a win.
So, mate, let's talk about that because, at that stage, as you said, you'd heard back in the commando element was getting raised, and it was starting to transition to the SS side of things. At that point, you march into 4RAR in June 2000, and what do you remember of on arrival? And there's a couple of stories that I want to touch on in the early part of with your Cam Baird and also Hans Fleer, who you would absolutely become both icons of the unit. But what was happening in and around that when you marched in 2000?
Same sort of mindset. It was, I've become a senior at Singleton. I think I'm pretty good at going feral, and being a filthy mongrel in the field. I've learnt the infantry motto. I know how to handle a whole bunch of weapon systems. I know how to carry a pack. And, I think I'm pretty good because I've done the hardcore, which is the exercise at the end that, everyone tells you that if you can get through that, then you've qualified for the green beret and the RAR badge. So there was all that. So it's like, yeah, I think I'm doing pretty good. I'm 17. I've just kicked into touch Kapuka and Singo in 3 months. I think I'm freaking pretty sharp. Yeah, we're sweet. And then, yeah, again, it was just another snap kick to the throat when you arrive at a RAR brackets Commando Regiment and you are introduced to a word or 2 words or 3 words, old school Bravo. So that's where the iconic Bravo company was introduced into young Andy Steele's mind. And you get off the bus, you are ushered up into the lines, which is another story in itself. But you'd see these very fit, very focused, purposeful, iconic. Just walked off a GQ or Men's Health magazine with an Australian uniform on. Walking around with the Sherwood Green Beret on, and thinking, hey man, if you think you were faking until you're making it and you've landed in a place where you can continue this, wrong. So that was my mindset when I got to Holsworthy Barracks for RAR Commando. With that said, what was the culture? The culture was with those guys very focused. The aroma of why we were there, like I said, it was expressed to us at Singleton that, hey, you can put your preference on where you want to go, but you're going to go where the army needs you. And it didn't take a genius to figure out what was going on. There was some subtle hints that 4RAR were going to be one of the next to go to East Timor. They're going to be building this unit up as an infantry battalion to step in and do their part in East Timor. So there was that. With that as well, I think we've laboured the point with other podcasts about Fight Club. So people can tap into other podcasts that you've done to get the piece on that. I won't labour that one. I think we've flogged that one to death enough. We had Tag West, which was the regiment, SASR. I think it was 3 Squadron. They were flying around in Black Hawks at Holsworthy Barracks as the counterterrorism capability for the Olympic Games for 2000. So with all that said, you've got a lot going on in a 17-year-old and change mind, new to the army, man mountains, walking around with green berets, Black Hawks with black dudes dangling their feet out with guns, flying into Sydney City at night. Then, in addition to that, a period where there was an opportunity for us, fresh meat that came to the unit, to express our interest on whether we wanted to drop anchor, grow roots, and show the attributes or the interest in embarking on that kind of career. So Charlie Company back then, because there was an established Bravo company, was the training company where everyone that was getting posted into 4RAR was getting thrown into. And, it went into that military kind of formation where you had platoons, multiple platoons with sections, and you'd be allocated. And it was really, hey guys, the main forecast for why you're here, end state, is you're all going to be infantrymen. They're going to be trained up. We're going to pick up the slack on the stuff that you didn't pick up on at infantry school. Bearing in mind it was only a 45-day course. Now we're going to pick up on the pieces that you missed, a lot of the heavy weapons, grenades, so on and so forth. in addition to that, we're going to start training you guys up and see which of you have the attributes and focus and commitment to embark on a career within the Special Forces. And there's going to be a 14-week program. It's either keep up or stay up, or you're going to be done. So we started to fall into that regime where it was a very, very well organized 14-week training program. Now, we're pretty fit when we got there. You've been conditioned for the hardcore, which gets you to that infantry soldier level, but then this took you to that high point of preparing you for the barrier test. So it was a component of the physical fitness regimes. You'd be doing PT at least twice a day. Sometimes you'd get rest days. On Fridays, you'd be doing a ruck march, at least 15 clickers. So you had the weekend to put your life back together. And then, you'd be bombarded by, another swim sesh, run sesh, 3.2 prep sesh Monday. And while you're putting your life together between eating and resting, you're getting trained on navigation, medical, comms, field craft, everything that at that point, and I think, this is important to note. Like I said, we had 3 squadron that were there at Holsworthy preparing for the Olympic Games. Some of the guys that were interested from the regiment came over and they participated in a lot of that training. So they were some of our, I don't want to say instructor cadre or director staff, but they were some of our mentors during that. Hey man, this is Fieldcraft 101. We're the recon gurus within the Australian Army. This is how you set up, fill in the blank. This is how you patrol. This is how you do this. This is how you set up your kit. So we had a lot of those awesome, old regiment cats that came and pressed on us some of that, I guess, what would you say, established and, veteran-like capability onto us guys. So we had that. And in addition to that, you had the prep for our role for Op Gold or the Olympics in Sydney. And that was the outer cordon. So to kind of paint that picture for the listener, you've got Tag West, the SAS, which are the direct action executive response to the terrorist event. In order for that to happen, you're going to need an outer cordon for them to go in and take care of business and make sure that there's separation between the regular population and what's going on inside what they're doing. So that was our role. So we did a lot of training with that as well, some riot control, some call outs, making sure that guys can put their life together at last minute's notice, get down to the parade ground, get on a bus and head down and do whatever's necessary to do that role if in the event something was to happen during that period of the Olympics. So with all that said, that was the tempo, man. It was busy for me, just trying to keep up. I think I did a pretty good job at it, looking back on it. But in order to keep up, I had to have my head screwed on.
Yeah, far out, mate. Busy time. And mate, as we mentioned, this was where you met Cam Baird, and he become an icon in the regiment in the years to come. And like I've spoken to guys and like many guys you've served with, and they've said, he was the Commando's commando. And just a legend of a guy and just a great dude. But mate, there's a funny story that you know, and mate, I'd love it if you could share that story between Cam and Hans Flair.
Yeah. So to kind of like paint it, I don't want to be long-winded, but I think it's kind of important. When I met Cam, I want to say, the average type size human. 17. He was a couple, maybe, I think he was like a year, maybe 2 years older than I was. Very big man, very athletic looking individual, born with a six pack, no doubt. However, similar path. Well, I don't want to say similar because that kind of puts me up on his pedestal, and I don't want to do that. He was a naturally gifted athlete to the point where, as I'm sure a lot of the listeners know through other guys talking about it, he was teasing at that tier one athletic level in AFL. I definitely wasn't at that pedigree as a rugby player, but he was fouled with injury, similar to me. And as we got to know each other, that was common ground to begin with. When you add the competitive nature of us being reasonably athletically talented, there was that natural competitiveness and will to win. That obviously allowed us to have a good ingredient to be in the same environment. We enjoyed the same music. We loved doing karaoke, freaking dance competitions out on the piss on a Friday night, that type of thing. But luckily enough for me, I think naturally enough for Betty there was the criteria of the conclusion of that 12-week package of the train-up when we all went to Charlie Company that, it became quite normal for guys to fall off, whether it be through injury, lack of, passion to continue, inability to maintain the skill set with fitness or the aptitude, whatever the case may be. Guys started to fall off. And, like I said, Betty, always on top of the pyramid. He was always going to reach barrier. Myself, faking it till you're making it, reading self-help books, probably listening to bloody recordings of, I don't know, whatever that Anthony bloke is that talks about,
Tony Robbins. Tony Robbins.
Old Tony Robbins. Probably listening to that, between sessions with my CD player back then. Made the cut. So Betty and I, we did barrier. Obviously made the standards required. I kind of, fell through my feet, getting through that one. And then here, both Betty and some of the other guys that you've spoken to, and again, guys that were there know who they are. Guys that are still in the unit or prefer not to be spoken about, I'll reserve their names, but you know who you are. We all fell onto the Commando selection, and we were out at this point in time out at Singleton, and we were again shock and awe. Here we are on a Australian Special Forces selection, regular pattern of the day. You're already hurting, already fatigued, haven't eaten enough, haven't slept enough. You're seeing new faces. You're hearing of iconic faces, and one iconic face that had turned up was a gentleman by the name of Major Hands Clear, aka the Iceman. So he gets up. He's the senior instructor for the selection. He introduces himself. It's interesting, or it's unique to know that we had seen this individual that hadn't heard him say anything for a matter of days by now, and thought, who's this guy? And again, he's a tall guy, has a presence without saying anything. And finally, we get the introduction that this is Major Hands Clear, senior instructor, SAS veteran, Vietnam vet, has honors and awards from Vietnam, and I'll save you the details on that one because I'm sure I'd dull it down if I was to recite order that he got for his medal. But long story short, this guy knows what's going on. He's a SAS cat, Vietnam vet. He obviously knows a thing or two, and has probably seen a few things as well. So he gets up and he's talking about attributes and why we're here and the appropriate candidate, and they're looking for the right kind of person and giving us the good oil on, there's X amount of people here, and my predictions from being around long enough, it's safe to say that probably less than a quarter of you will be here at the end, and so on and so forth. So I'm kind of building up like the kind of environment and the intensity that this guy's building it up to. And everyone in the audience is trying to be the right fit. It's been told to us from day one that they're not looking for the best guy, they're looking for the right guy. So everyone's watching their P's and Q's, and Major Flair at this point asks a question that everyone is kind of rattled by, saying, where's the effect of what's the job of a commando? And he goes around the room 3 or 4 times, fail on the execution of the answer. Everyone trying to be diplomatic that, you're there to, protect the country, do the best interests of Australia, protect your mates, trying to really do it politely. And finally, Betty puts his hand up, and Hans Flair goes, candidate, whatever it was. I don't remember what number he was. And Betty, excuse my language, just says everything that, one, Hans Flair wanted to hear, and two, everyone in the audience knew what they were wanting to say, just weren't sure whether it was appropriate to say it. And Betty, in his brash, appropriate self point in time, just says, Commando's job is to fucking kill cunts. And Hans Flair just looks down at the ground. There's an awkward silence, just enough for everyone to go, either that was the answer that he was looking for, or he's going to politely ask Cam Baird to excuse himself from the course. Hans brings his head up, gives a 180 admission to the crowd, and says, that's exactly right. So that's the kind of guy that Cam was. He, and I'll get into the other side of Cam later on, but he knew exactly what, at the end of the day, his job was as a commando.
Mate, that's unreal. Like that, and as you say, and I'll tell the audience, I'll fill in the gaps, Andy. Hans Flair was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which is one medal below the Victoria Cross. So I recently had Dan Fortune on, and Dan spoke, so Distinguished Service Cross and Bar, and that was what he joined the regiment, mate, when he spoke very highly of Hans and what he was, the man he was. And go back and listen to a few other podcasts where Damian Tomlinson talks about Hans Flair as well. And mate, iconic in the Special Forces world. And so painting the picture for the listener, like this guy was, he was an amazing guy, and there was an aura to him.
Oh, absolutely. And if I could take the mic again, Adam, I remember this was after that episode. We were out in the field. Again, Andy Steele, dragging off as usual. We were out, period of darkness again. It could have been 10 o'clock at night. It could have been 2 a.m. in the morning. I don't know. And I'm kind of sitting up against a tree, hurting as usual, and just regular period of darkness, regular atmospherics, regular noises. I thought I was capable enough to hear someone if they were to approach in the Australian outback at close proximity. And the next thing I know, I have the tapping of a finger on my shoulder with the sudden warm but silent breath of a human over my shoulder, and lo and behold, who it is. It's Major Hands Flair asking me, one, if I'm awake, two, do I want to continue with the course, and three, where am I on the map? So obviously an awkward silence for all three of those questions, but determined enough to say yes, yes, and give me a minute, I'll figure it out. So naturally pulling out my map, getting my freaking rain jacket out to make sure that, when I pop a bit of light, red light on the ground, to have a look at my map under my jacket, give him, I guess, an acceptable location on the map. And when I bring up the courage to let him know where I was on the map, he's already gone without me knowing. So just for the listener, that's the kind of individual that you're dealing with, that was where the term phantoms of the jungle came from, which, depending on how interested the listener is, you can pick up that book somewhere and you'll be able to read a little bit more about Hans Flair and Graham Bremer and some of the other guys that have that stigma about them.
Absolutely, mate. And I want to touch on it too, Andy, with you, is like you talk about you did your barrier and you do selection. How many started with you, mate, and how many finished? And for you, looking back now, what was the toughest part of selection for you?
Yeah, mate, I want to say it was about 120. 120 dudes turned up. When we finished selection, about 30 finished, and then about 25 were actually recommended or passed. So at the end of the course, if you're still there, you may finish it, and that's always a good number to remember. But then you've got let me remember if I might be stacking up the name, like an interview board, a board of studies, I think the word was, to claim it correctly. You go in as an individual, and you've got like the senior instructors, a couple of the director staff, a psychologist, and a few other, maybe a PDI and someone else in there. I'm sure, Mick Slattery is probably in there, and we'll talk about him in a minute. And they kind of just give you like a debrief on how you went. So depending on how that went and your performance in that interview or board of studies, they will spit out a response on whether you are, fit to progress with training. So, there you go, your 120, your 30, 25 for that answer.
Yeah.
Like the hardest part, mate, the sleep deprivation, that was a new one for me. I hadn't really been exposed to that, so that was pretty hard. The food deprivation, being a kid and Kapuka, Singleton, I got enough food at Kapuka, whether it be in the field or in barracks at Singo. You really didn't get deprived food. But this was where it was a game changer, where it was like, okay, we're cutting food for you, and let's see how you can operate without food and sleep. So that was a good one. And then I want to say learning to be always under the microscope with minimal feedback on performance. And for me, that created a lot of doubt, especially during like isolated portions of the course. So when you're doing like your navigation, you're on your own. You're given a list of locations that you've got to meet on a map, but you're doing it on your own. So I think they call it silent running, where they'll tell you where you got to go. You can look to your left, you can look to your right, you can look front and back to kind of compare where you are and how you are on the measuring stick with the other 120 people that are on the course. But at that point, you don't have anything So there's that mind game of like, am I doing good? Am I doing bad? Am I doing enough? Is it time to pull the pin and go like, this is no good to me? So for me at that age, like that was pretty tough for me to create that. Hey man, like you're doing the freaking best you can. So that for me, that was the tough part. That was
So
the tough part for me.
because mate, you're what, 18 when you go on selection?
Man, I was still, and that came up at the end at the border studies. That's what they said. They said, oh, you kind of you scraped through, mate. You probably weren't the best one the, the group, but for an 18-year-old, 19-year-old bloke, you did all right. And I had to respond, and I said, oh, um, yeah, I'm only 17, and they were like, what? And I was like, yeah, sirs. I turn 18 in like, I don't know, a couple of months. So that for them was, they were like a little like, Jesus, right? There's a couple of things under their man. But yes, the answer to the question, yeah, I was still pretty young.
Far out, mate. To even like pass selection, mate, at 17 to have the mental resolve, mate, to keep going, keep pushing, mate. Like hard, mate. Like you're still a kid. Like you're not Andy. You're not an adult. You're still a kid. Like and to have all this happen to you at 17, and I want to highlight that for the listener, mate, because there are 17-year-old kids, mate, that will listen to this and go, holy crap, Andy was my age and he's just gone through one of the toughest, brutal selection processes to enter the special forces. Like that's something pretty special, Andy. Like that's something, a feather in your cap, mate.
Oh man, I appreciate it, but for the village idiot that was there, mate, I struggled. I struggled, but I was blessed to pull out sufficient goods on the day of the race.
And mate, you're very humble and very modest, mate. I will say that to you, mate. And you always have been. And mate, I want to talk about, so as you mentioned, you were fit, and most guys that I've spoken to have said that the 3.2 is the killer. Did you have any problems with the 3.2? And I've recently just had Bergs on, and he said he
Yeah.
struggled with that 3.2. Did you have any struggles, or you were okay?
Well, the luxury, me versus Bergs, is I'm a little bit taller.
Yes, you are.
I had a little bit more wingspan, I guess, leg span, however you want to take figuratively. Uh, I was kind of lucky when it came to the 3.2. I was, you know, regional level cross country in high school. So, you know, being conditioned from high school, I still was well rehearsed in that interval training, uh, short to mid distance running, and I kind of that was like an easy one for me. And then just to throw that extra bit of kit on, your web gear, carrying a rifle was definitely different because if anyone that goes out and just wants to run around the block a couple of times, you've got two legs and two arms that you can use to propel yourself across the Earth's surface. But when you put a rifle in one of those arms, you're kind of restricted. Um, that was a bit of a challenge, but no. Short answer, Adam. That was one of the God passes that he gave me on. All right, I'll give you this one as a free pass, Andy. You can do this one, and I think I looked at my barrier test results just before I came on the show about a week ago, and I think I banged that one in at 14 minutes and 50. So that one, like I said, there was doubt with the silent running. I knew that I knew that I kicked that one in the ass. So that was a win for me.
So, mate, finish selection. Proud moment for you because you've just finished selection. But I know most of the guys I have spoken to from the unit is that that's like it's a false peak. Like you've passed selection, but then you go
Yep.
on to the Rio cycle, mate, and talk me through Rio cycle and what was the toughest part of Rio for you, and did you have any guys that didn't make it through Rio?
Uh, yes. Yeah, we did. Um, this was like we were talking about the unit, even after the original newspaper clipping that I read, now a couple of years ago, now being in the unit, there's the staging of 4RAR for East Timor on the horizon. This was back when the Rio course hadn't really been established. And when I say that, it was a little bit dislodged. So it uncommon to now, what I assume now, I'm not fully plugged into the unit and its practices now, but I'm under the impression that you do selection, and then once you're successful, it's a series of your entire Rio under SFTC or whatever it's called now. Back then, it was kind of like plug and play, where, hey, have we got enough resources available? Have we got enough um, training facilities available? Do we have enough time available to foster a course in whatever the skill set is to get these guys through? So back then, I did the selection, and then I did amphib, and I did my para course. Um, and with those three, I knocked those out. And then I can talk about the other ones that I did after a little bit later on after Timor. But with those three, amphib, man, amphib was a struggle for me. And for the guys out there that have been in the unit or similar units, they'd be well rehearsed in the phrase amphib arse, where amphib arse is by definition constantly having a wet, cold arse that has been continually battered by a con- continuously uncertain surface of the water. And when you do that for 2 plus 3 weeks, yeah, you'll be a statistic of amphibars. And yeah, that's what I remember, mate. And it's in the peak of winter. You're consistently cold, tired, and when you're based out of Spectacle Island in Sydney Harbour for 3 weeks, yeah, man, I found it freaking painful. I found it painful, but enjoyable. Like, I don't know how you can say that it was painful, but it was enjoyable because you're doing
And
cool shit, but you're hurting.
mate, and this is where you met, as you mentioned, a great mate of mine and a previous guest of the podcast, Mick Slattery, and also the late Pete Caife and the late Chris Gotch, mate. And what was that like, mate, working alongside these guys?
Wow. So, good question. I'll hit it off with Gotchi because that was specific to Amphib. I'd seen Gotchi in the chow hall or the mess hall and thought, yep, that cat, he's definitely one of those dudes that you would have seen in a Commando magazine. Um, he's a Commando. And now we're in his arena. Like, he was the Amphib guru. So anything that Gotch had to say as a young pup, I made sure that I turned my freaking hearing aids up and I listened. And yeah, Gotchi and I, not at that point in time, because I think, being so young, there was a little bit of a vendetta against who's this young kid. Like, no, we need to flick him off the deck. He's definitely not one of us. But later on, we tended to grow a lot closer because it was like I had kind of earned it, paid my penance, run the gauntlet and survived. So yeah, that was Gotchi. He was that guy. He was a commando. Um, when you talk about Pete Caife, Pete, he started barrier and did selection with me, but um, he went off and he was more of like a recon guru. So he didn't really go through the rest of those Rio courses with me. I don't remember him being on Amphib with us. I mean, he's an older cat, so he had kids and whatnot. Para, he came from 3RAR, so he didn't go to para school with us. But yeah, I remember, and being one of the younger dudes, he was part of the 14 platoon, but one of the older guys that kind of just transitioned to up armor infantry companies in 4R because a lot of us were young, fresh meat from Singo, so they had to get some of the senior guys from around the country to fill in some of those key section commander positions. So he did that. So he was definitely one of those cats that I grabbed by the belt buckle and if he didn't want to mentor me, I kind of made him mentor me. And yeah, that's where the relationship began with Pete and I, and then with Big Mick Slats. He was obviously the medic guru through a lot of that 14 platoon company, Charlie company train up. So he was the guy that we'd go to train up on a lot of that med piece. And then later on down the track, he was one of the grand masters of the unarmed combat back then. So he took point on when I did my unarmed combatives because, like I said, he was one of the guys that knew how to whip some ass. And that's where our relation started to be groomed. And, me becoming a medic when one of my skill sets was a medic, we fostered that relationship as him being, a real good dude that knows how to patch wounds and plug holes.
Yeah, he's an absolute legend, mate. Legend of a bloke and a great mate. And people go back and listen to Mick Slattery's podcast because,
Yep.
and what he did mate, in that unit is, it's paved the way forward now to where the unit is now.
Completely.
And so, mate, you finish Rio. And as you said, Amphib was probably the hardest part. And then, mate, talk me through getting finally presented your beret, mate, and the famous green beret. What was that like for you, mate? It's being so young too. Looking back now, do you think you appreciated it for what it was back then, or not so much? You were just too young.
That's a loaded question. So I'll unpack that. The beret parade didn't exist. It was more or less turn up to work the following day once you finished at that point. I think it was selection, amphib, para, and maybe like special weapons or something, and you were beret qualified, base level. So when I finished, whether it be para or amphib, whatever it was, whoever it was at the time, my platoon sergeant or platoon commander was like, "Hey, Andy, well done, mate. You can turn up the beret. You can turn up tomorrow for first parade with a green beret. Well done, champ. Like, bit of a slap on the ass. Let's get to it." And that was really it. So to me, I was like, "Oh, okay, well done. I better go down to the clothing store and buy myself a Sherwood grenade and ask someone how to bash it right and put the RAR badge down and hope for the best." So that really was like a nothing to me. Whereas now, whispers through, guys that I've worked with from the past, Bergs, that have got a little bit more association with the unit still, guys that still are associated with the unit now that I talk to, they say that it's a completely different space where, it's bring in the families, we'll get the bells and whistles out. We'll buy a freaking bucket of ice cream. We might even get a freaking jumping castle for the kids, that type of action where, and I think they even get like a commando blade, one of the double-edged original iconic commando daggers. So with that said, no, it wasn't like that when I went through. Looking back on it, did it matter? No. Am I a little bit sore? Yeah, maybe. Now that it is worth the recognition, but back then, I don't think the unit had established itself to prove that it had that prestige. So I think you kind of get like a hall pass on that one at the more corporate level of what guys had achieved. But I was just happy to be there, Adam, and I was doing what I wanted to be doing.
So, mate, you mentioned earlier on you finished Rio cycle. What company did you march into after you'd finished Rio? And you mentioned that you'd worked on the 2000 Olympics as well. And mate, was that a proud moment working on your home Olympics? Like everyone remembers, I remember them, mate, the Olympics, and that would have been a proud moment too.
Yeah, I think it was definitely being part of the army, doing Kapuka, Singo, marching into a battalion, having that visualization that it had been a peacetime army for however long, and then actually, whether you were carrying guns overseas, which you weren't, you were actually potentially deployable on your own soil for such an iconic event like the Olympics. Yeah, I felt like I was actually functioning like a soldier. It wasn't like I was like a uni student that had graduated, being a school teacher, but hadn't actually taught a class yet. Like I actually felt like I was teaching classes by now. So that was good. I felt like I was participating. When I finished that limited part of the Rio cycle, I actually stayed in Charlie Company, where after that whole opportunity where guys had that 14-week train up had kind of dissolved, it actually started to focus on post Op Gold, the Olympics. Okay, well, we're starting to prepare for our deployment to East Timor. And I actually stayed in Charlie Company. I went and did a support course. I think Berg spoke about it, DFSW. And funnily enough, Big Bed Wado, Cam was on that bad boy as well. So we did that DFSW course. And, just to add in there, the kind of guy that Cam was, like, as I say to people even to this day, like, I'm always the dumbest person in every classroom that I walk into. And Betty, like, he's the kind of guy that will take the time to sit down with you and help you out. And I remember there was a subject, and it was called Armored Fighting Vehicle Recognition. So for people that don't know what I just said, it's being able to recognize stuff on the battlefield that are either friendly or enemy armored vehicles, and it helps you understand what they are and if you can shoot them at them or not. And there was this Buggerlugs instructor. I'm not going to mention his name, but he was a bit of a crazy one, and he had like these little miniature models that he'd obviously, I don't know, got out of someone's freaking rape dungeon, and painted them up, and he'd put them out, maybe 5-6 meters in front of you, out on the grass, and there'd be a line where you would stand and you were tested on your ability to recognize what they are. And they give you like some handheld binoculars, and you'd have to look at the specific, details of the model and figure out what it was. So the point I'm getting at is like I was freaking horrendous at it, and I remember sitting around at the barracks, before we went to have, dinner, and Betty'd be out there messing around with these little models and challenging me on what they were, and it was through Betty having the time to sit down with me and look at these models that I got the tick in the box for that. But yes, that was Cam. We did DFSW together. Cam stayed in Charlie Company. He went into one of the rifle platoons. I went to the DFSW det for Charlie Company, and that's where I stayed through the pre-deployment up to East Timor. But then once I got there, and I'm sure we'll get onto that, there were some changes made and where I went once I got to Timor.
Yeah, well, mate, let's crack on into your first deployment to East Timor, mate. 2001. Talk me through it and how long were you over there, and what do you remember of this first trip, first deployment, mate, for you?
Yeah. So I was over there just short of 6 months. Went over there as I think I'd turned 18 by now, so I was fit to deploy off Australian shores as a soldier. All that minor policy and regulation stuff had been dealt with. We got over there, first gig, pretty overwhelming. I definitely remember the heat. I definitely remember the smell. Now I'm really doing the job. It's not just me potentially doing stuff as a soldier for the Olympic Games. I'm actually over on foreign soil with live guns, actually over there to do a job, and that job being peacekeeping. Initially, like I said, I was part of that DFSW detachment where we were mounted on SRVs, surveillance and reconnaissance vehicles, and we were with a six-man team, and we drove around, just proving routes, escorting logistic and admin vehicles around the area of operations. From there, not to kind of dig into the guy that I replaced, but, like I said, East Timor, it was a huge climate change. The atmosphere with the humidity and the terrain was pretty rugged. There was one guy that was part of the outfit. He was like a Canadian dude. He came from Canada, and he just, through no real fault of his own, he just couldn't adapt to the climate conditions. So with that said, they swapped him out for me, putting him in a car, and I took his spot as a section machine gunner and replaced him, and did that for a little while, and then I actually moved up as the section scout that I really aspired and loved doing. So I finished that gig as the scout. But if you've got time, I can share a pretty brutally humiliating and embarrassing story about that transition from different positions as an infantryman and the outcomes of that.
Yeah, mate, sure, mate. Fire away, mate. We've got all the time in the world, mate. So yeah, fire away.
Yeah, so still a young pup, still getting a grip on the world. First gig overseas, transitioning from being the what do we call it? I'm just trying to differentiate between what we call it in the States, the 240. We call it the Mag 58 in Australia. I don't know whether they still call it that, but yeah, the Mag 58, the 7.62 big rig. That was the weapons platform that I was the gunner on in the SRV in that six-man DFSW detachment. So transitioning from that to an infantry platoon as a section machine gunner, I went and transitioned to the F-89 Minimi, as they call it. Did that for, I don't know, maybe a couple of months. And when I transitioned from the section machine gunner to the forward scout, I was awarded the original iconic Vietnam issued M16 with the M203 grenade launcher under it. And we, as a platoon, and I'm sure there's a specific listener out there that I can't speak of because he's still in the military and the dizzy heights of command. He was, I think, a sergeant at the time. We were on a range practice down out the front of Ada Bulletin, which is where the base was for Charlie Company. And we were doing a range exercise, just, doing some practices with our grenade launchers. And as guys that have served know that there's multiple munitions that you can use for the grenade launcher. And to be more specific, you've got illumination rounds that when you shoot them, preferably in the air, they will illuminate the sky. And you've got high explosive dual purpose rounds that when you shoot those, they will act very similar to a hand grenade and detonate on impact. And as the range supervisor explained, there will be a series of, I think it was, 4 rounds illume per firer in your own time go on. And, I guess I'm trying to excuse myself out of the hole here, but, end state is it was me just being a shitty operator with my kit. I wasn't familiar with where the illumination rounds were in my pouches and where my high explosive dual purpose rounds were in my pouches. So when Private Andy Steele fires 4 rounds into the air, luckily onto the horizon of the ocean, he launches 4 high explosive dual purpose rounds into the atmosphere. And when the rest of the firers are observing their rounds illuminating the sky, and as the range instructor is observing the rounds that are anticipated lighting up the sky, and a series of seconds later on the far limits of the ocean horizon, there are 4 consecutive explosions. Andy Steele knows that he has not listened to the appropriate range commands and deployed the wrong munition. So needless to say, that caused some headache for Private Andrew Steele.
Sorry, mate. I'm laughing, but it's a funny story looking back now.
Oh, mate. So yeah, if I was wearing white undies on that day, they were no longer white undies. But to intensify the story, clearly I knew that there was going to be some heartache and pain for the weeks to come. Luckily enough, I was permitted to be off the leash a little bit the following morning, and there was a couple of us that would go and just run on the beach in the morning for PT. So, we'd run down there, and I was down there with the weapon of choice itself under my arm, carrying my M16 203, running down the beach. And there's a crowd of very happy East Timorese that were wanting to express through broken East Timorese and Portuguese English that they were very happy that whatever the Australians did last night that produced so many fish on the beach, can they do it again?
Oh, mate, what a cracking story, mate. That is. Oh, mate.
So that the perspective, the glory of my mistake. However, I think I lost, a couple of weeks' pay, and I had restriction of privileges. I was having to, clean the freaking toilets and, probably clean the kitchen pans and pots for a while. So yeah,
I,
that's the product of changing from roles in an infantry unit as an idiot.
well, mate, a lesson learned, a hard lesson learned, but going forward. But, mate, I want to talk about, as we mentioned, 9/11. Were you in country in East Timor when this day happened? And did you think that what you were witnessing that day would we would be involved in Australia's longest war, looking back then?
Uh so yeah, I was in East Timor. Um we were on a green hat patrol up on the TCL, the Tactical Coordination Line, out of a patrol base called Sparrow. And when we got that information, or that limited information, we didn't know exactly what had happened until we were extracted from the field. Um, so it was a little bit blurry. So none of us really took it seriously in that section patrol. Um, Once we got the full picture and saw on the news, on the reruns, like I knew that the change that would have created, it was going to have a huge impact. Then from there, I was kind of like, I don't want to say I was like half deep committed into the military, because I was, that you get my point. But from then on, I realized that my military career was going to be more than just peacekeeping and peacetime army. I didn't know or exactly understand what that would look like, but I knew for a fact that somehow I'd be responding to the 9/11 actions and then the future global war against terror.
So, mate, was there talks at the unit of raising the second tactical assault group from what had happened in America at that point, or that you can remember?
I'm not 100% sure, like on the strategic level prior to, when those conversations were happening, when SASR 3 Squadron were over as TAG West, as it's now called now, TAG back then, there might have been some discussions about stepping up a capability, but I don't know whether that went into fruition because they were waiting for 4IR to return from East Timor to actually have that conversation at that governmental level. But once 9/11 happened, yeah, I'm pretty sure that if they had put a pin in it, that defense and the government had definitely re-raised that conversation and put it on the map that 4RER were going to step up their game, and that was going to become one of the level one priorities for the unit.
So you come back from that trip, mate, and there's 2002, and this is where we've mentioned throughout the podcast, mate. You meet Craig Hamburger, mate. What was that like, meeting Bergs?
Yeah, that was so. I had known Bergs in the Charlie Company 14 platoon crowd, but at like the peripheral distance, I knew he was the little fella that was a hard charger that freaking loved it. That was all about doing commando rolls down freaking Sydney trains out on the mongrel. But I hadn't really touched the guy and really felt his energy. But once we had got back from Timor, I was one of the guys that didn't pursue the black roll tag east raising, and we can talk about that later. I kind of just fell back into the unit after vacation, after post deployment vacation. Yeah. So when I really met Bergs was when we went over to Perth, and that was a trip for like a train the trainer on like heavy weapons. So when I'm talking about heavy weapons, it was like the Mark 19, which is the machine gun grenade launcher, and the Javelin, the tank buster, the iconic new revolutionary weapon system that blows tanks out of the ground, bunker busters. So that was when I'd actually got to really get to know Bergs. I did get to see him on DFSW, but he was in a different kind of team. So it was still at a distance. But that's when I really started to get a feel for the man himself,
And
Bergs.
yeah, absolute little, as you mentioned, mate. I know Slats spoke of him when he marched. It was literally you saw
Yeah,
boots and a pack. That was
yep,
Bergs.
pretty much.
Yeah.
Yep, something out of Mario Kart.
Absolute legend, mate, and his yeah, go back and listen to episode 100. It's just
Yeah,
by the time this comes out, Andy, this Bergs' podcast will have been out for a little while. But yeah, go back and listen to Bergs' podcast because it's an absolute ripper. And mate, I want to talk about 2003. You so '02, you're doing your courses, you're back in the unit. '03, you post into Bravo Company with Cam, Bergs, and many others as the original Bravo guys. And mate, you deployed to Iraq. Talk me through this deployment, your second deployment overseas.
yeah. Um, Finished all my Rio. Started to get comfortable that I was now not just 3 courses deep, very qualified. I was now, more qualified with all of the follow-on reinforcement cycle courses now. At that point in time, post 9/11, personally, I was kind of mentally at a point where I'm sure that we're going to start scratching the edges on the Middle East. And for me, I was more inclined to expecting to go and support the SASCAPs in Afghanistan. Andy Russell, we lost Andy Russell in 2002 when there was the initial invasion, when the Aussies contributed to the first piece of Afghanistan. So I thought we were just going to follow on with the effects of that. But they pulled out after that victory, or that what we expected victory over the insurgency and the Taliban and the Osama bin Laden regime. However, that kind of took a pivotal change in direction, and those discussions of Iraq started to get entertained. And that's where we really, as a young digger then, I wasn't really privy to the information, but there was other different pieces of the atmosphere that were expressing to us that Australia and the government are taking it pretty seriously, because we were going off, and like I said, Bergs and I had gone off, and a few other guys over to Perth to get called up on those heavy weapon systems, which we initially thought that were more based towards Afghanistan. But when we got back and we started to get more culture briefs about Iraq, you've got the news and the media footage of the position of the US and their issues with Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, Saddam Hussein. We shipped up to Canungra. I'd transitioned at this point to Bravo Company, like you said, and they said that we're going to go up there, and as we're starting to get into those more big army collaborations of multiple elements being involved. Now it's just not just commandos; it's in the army. Now we've got Air Force assets involved. So if we're going to be going over to these countries, we're going to have other enablers. It's not just East Timor peacekeeping. We're going to have other mobility insertion methods. So with that said, they're like, we're going to go up to Canungra and we're going to start getting comfortable with the Chinooks and, loading on, getting familiar with those bad boys. That turned out into, it wasn't Chinook in orientation. It was resistance to interrogation training. So, for people out there, we were put in the bag and treated like prisoners of war. And once that was happening, we knew that this wasn't Afghanistan. This was we are facing not just an insurgency or a second or third grade military. The big army, the government is preparing us to face what we all anticipated we were going to be facing in Desert Storm 1, Iraq. So with that said, there was a lot of mental searching on my behalf for that transition. And, if I can dig into that a little bit deeper, as a still, what am I now? 19, I'm still, skipping around, late teens, 19, maybe 20 now. This isn't backyard. I've got a live gun just over in the South Pacific, East Timor. This is, we're really getting on a plane and pushing up into the Northern Hemisphere, into the Badlands of the Middle East, and we're facing Saddam Hussein that has been strategically accused of weapons of mass destruction. We're going to be facing the Saddam Fedayeen, which is the equivalent to the Iraqi Special Forces. I've been exposed to desert warfare, heavy weapons, resistance to interrogation. This is big. If we have the assets of the US to be relied upon now, I think I need to start pulling my socks up and taking this stuff a little bit more seriously. We're not in we're not in Kansas anymore type mentality, So that kind of was a big changer for me, as a soldier, as a human being, that now I need to start taking seriously the fact that I may need to really be okay with taking life and not just peacekeeping, and protecting, innocent civilians. Like, this could get kinetic. The lead up to that, finally, we got the formal, hey, you guys are going to be going to the MEAO, which is the Middle East Area of Operations. They still were very hesitant on telling us, hey, you're going to be banging it in Iraq for whatever diplomatic reasons. But we all started to realize that, yeah, we're going to be making our way to Iraq. At what capacity, we don't know. But we got a jersey. I'm going. And that was a big thing for me and a lot of the guys that were fresh off the press, Bergs, Beatty, a lot of those guys, because now we were actually part of old school Bravo. So the guys that hadn't steered off course and stood up the original Tag East, us young pups were now part of old school Bravo, stepping into the first combat operation as a commando element in Bravo Company. So yeah, that were big shoes to fill. And then when we got there, a lot to take in, a lot to grow up into.
So, mate, talk me through Iraq. Like, you get in there, and what are some of the highlights of that deployment that you remember?
Yeah. So the flight was interesting. They had some random, cheap in full Australian government swing chartered flight from, I don't know, probably Portugal or some country. They didn't speak English very well. And we're flying in on this decent sized aircraft. There's about a company of us, and we're at a regular flying altitude, and then all of a sudden the bird just falls out of the sky. We drop. I mean, I'm not an aviator, but it feels like a significant altitude where I remember one of the other guys, and I'm sure he knows who he is, if he hears the podcast, like the plane was falling, and if you didn't have your seatbelt on, which most guys that were sitting did, I remember one guy that was walking down to the bathroom, the plane fell, and he actually like was absorbed from the foot or the aisle of the aircraft and was like being pulled or held on the surface of the skin of the aircraft above it. And I mean, that was the first impression of like, I think we're going to die. And after that, looking back, I'm sure there was more conversation, but I don't think there was enough conversation for Andy Steele. I think that was pretty untidy and inappropriate, and there should be some kind of like conversation with the pilot about that. But unexpectedly, like the pilot or the co-pilot or whoever it was, once they regained consciousness or regained the controls of the aircraft, whatever the case may be, whether they were drinking or whatever, it was just a simple, broken English, "Mascuzi," kind of like response by the pilot of like, "Oh, this is like, that's all you're gonna get. Like something happened. Mascuzi, like not a big deal. Like get over it." And so that was my first impression of, we could die. But after that, it was a sweet flight back or to the MEAO. So that was kind of the first impression that I remember. Once we got on the ground on where we were, we landed and we were confronted. It was cold in that region of the world, but that was the first time that I had seen what I thought was the full flex muscle of the US military. And, I was like pretty impressed. We've got anti-aircraft, we've got jet fighters, A-10s, F-16s, all of the heavy lifters, the bombers, radar systems, the military, the ground forces, all of the armored vehicles, tanks, you name it, it's there. And to me, as a young Australian soldier, I'm like, wow, like, okay, this is it. This is real. This is where this has taken me. You better start focusing on what your job is. We did a bit of training for a while the appropriate, intelligence feeds and all the enablers and all the shaping of operations at a coalition all fell into place. And, we did a lot of exercises and training. We experienced the dust storms, which, there's the iconic photo of birds that's down at the War Memorial now. So we got that experience of the Middle East. It was very contrary to what we saw in East Timor and what we traditionally see in Australia. It was a different way of being a soldier. We're now being exposed to aerial platforms, whether it be Chinooks, Black Hawks, that we were pretty new to experiencing, how to operate around aircraft, vehicles. Now we're starting to step into like desert warfare. So yeah, we do have the capability of being on foot, but we're starting to become more comfortable operating out of vehicles. And at that point in time, we still didn't know exactly what the commando role was. At that point, it was loosely expressed to us that we were going to be the regional combat search and rescue capability. So the SASCATs got into a stink. We could fly in on the back of birds and support them. If there was downed aircraft, whether that was the first, what they call it, the shock and awe campaign of the B-2 bombers, B-52 bombers, strike fighters, blowing out radar systems, all that sort of stuff on the initial campaign. We'd be the guys that would go in and assist in the extraction of the pilots. So we were all pretty hyped up about that. And then, as we're kind of stepping all on through those, stepping closer and closer to the region that we're going to be operating in, capabilities and roles continue to evolve. Finally, the war kicked off, and there were different elements that were moved around the battle space to do different roles. For us, we flew in to country, I think a couple of days after the initial invasion, and drove in part of the way across the Western Desert. And that was pretty inspiring, knowing full well that we flew in on. I want to say we did fly in on Australian C-130s, and we did do the iconic roll on, roll off the C-130s. And if anyone wants to Google that, that's pretty iconic. Where the aircraft, it'll fly in at an acceptable altitude. Once it gets into like a hot zone, it'll tack fly, which is pretty inspirational. Getting thrown around in the back of the C-130 while it's doing, its dance moves in the air, anticipating, ground to air, surface missiles, etc. And then wherever you drop into, they land, they hit the ground, they don't stop moving, their wheels are still moving on the ground, the ramp drops, and the SRVs or whatever vehicles you're rolling on, you're rolling off that ramp while the plane's still rolling, and that plane takes off. So that was pretty inspirational. For that one, I think I was a driver for an SRV. So, I mean, for anyone that, can drive like me, which is, barely, that was a tick in the box to fly in, get that SRV that was packed down, within an inch of its limits off the back of the ramp of a C-130 that's pretty tight under NVG. I think, again, that one, I put that one down to the guide that got me through that one. And yeah, so that was our infill into Iraq. We drove across some of the Western Desert, and it was pretty benign. Like, there was nothing, what we would expect or what I anticipated or experienced in Afghanistan. I'd say low threat environment, but still dealing with the casualties of war. You could still definitely see the effects of war, of the air war that had taken effect on the population and the civilian collateral. And then once things started to fall into play, we knew that the Saskats were ahead of us just a touch. They had just partially secured Al-Assad airfield, which was one of the strategic Air Force bases in Saddam Hussein's Air Force regimes out in the Western Desert. We secured that with them and held it for a while. Again, still just looking at the damage of war. Like, a lot of it, it went from that combat search and rescue role to bomb damage assessment responsibilities and supporting and enabling tasks to support the regiment. I remember turning up the Al-Assad Air Base, and that, I said that there was some of that result of the air campaign and some of the effects of the bombs. But when we hit Al-Assad, oh mate, like, that is where I saw the Arnold Schwarzenegger flex of the US military. Like, that airfield, the air base itself, any of the headquarter buildings, the guard towers, any of the visible aircraft. There was MiG-21s, MiG-29s. There was aircraft ground vehicle. Just, there was so much damage to a lot of the infrastructure that were from the bombs of the US that, as a young Australian, like, I'd never seen anything like that before with my naked eye. Like, yeah, I'd seen it in, like, encyclopedias, war magazines, Time magazines, that type of thing. But to see it with the naked eye, like I knew, man, like this is war. This is carnage. This is what bombs do. Like you have like this mental appreciation of what they do, but now you see the effect, and it's it was very confronting. So that was a lot to take on board as a young soldier. And then you had, once we'd occupied it and declared it as secure, we held it for a while. There was minor interactions with the public. They had not had food, their communications had been disabled, so they didn't know really what was going on. They wanted to make contact with what they were proposing us as, the freedom enablers for them. Some of them were like, the invaders, but, through interpretation and through, there was a lot of letter drops or message drops through the air campaign that was in their language saying, hey, to deal with coalition forces, you're safe, they're here to help you fight against the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, comply with them, approach them with care, but they're not here to hurt you, that type of thing. So, we were doing a lot of humanitarian aid, dealing with, sustaining them with food, that type of thing. But that was kind of difficult because it's difficult to know whether they were, probing to get information on what we were doing, what manpower we had, what tasks we were doing, that type of thing. So there was some stuff there. But, with all that being said, we're very cautious about what we're doing. With the patrol that I was with, we never got into any engagements. I think maybe once it got a little bit potentially hostile, but it was diffused quite quickly. But yeah, that was that. And then eventually, a few weeks after that, the environment became quite permissible. They wanted to get some mechanics in to disassemble one of the MiG-21s that a couple of my patrol got a picture on. But eventually the government's response was no, because eventually Iraq needed to re-raise their air force. So, hey, let's not be taking their stuff. And I'm sure that was like a political and a diplomatic reasoning, which, there and then, as a young soldier, I'm like, no, we take what we want. Like, it's ours now, but I'll leave that where it is. Now, as a bit of an older guy, yeah, I get it. But I think after all of that, seeing the full might of the US Army, dealing with UXOs. I remember we walked into a huge mechanic bunker. I think it was like the biggest like electric and power grid bunker to the entire base. They dropped a bunker buster bomb right through the top of it, and myself and the patrol went in there to check it all out. And as we made our way in, we were looking at a UXO, an unexploded, man. It had to have been a 2,000-pound bomb. And you could see that it just broken through the concrete and through the reinforced steel, and it was just sitting on top of this machinery. And it's like, that's probably not what we want to be standing next to. So, just those experiences of potential danger that, now I'm like being desensitized by, through a spiritual level, which I can talk about later, but probably by design. I started to be okay with that sort of stuff. And then, to finish off this, conversation, as our role was fulfilled, we did the Anzac Day piece, but I think other podcasts have explained that one. That one's pretty powerful. And my part to add to that was Australian F-18 Super Hornets, saw them and their commitment and their support to the Iraq campaign. I remember the Anzac Day we did, and I'd never seen them up close and personal. They did a flyover, and I think they were in pairs. They both, pushed the throttle and thumped a sonic boom. right above us, and I'd never seen anything like it. And that was like, keeping it G rated, like that was like next level impressive. So seeing that sort of stuff was really powerful as a young soldier. And then I think the icing on the cake to the actual, I wouldn't say combat, but the operational experience in Iraq actual was when us as the Australians were relieved by the Americans when the 7th Cav came in and relieved us of Al Assad. I remember our patrol were on like fire watch or just observation from the traffic control, and you just saw this dark mist of matter flying from the distance over the desert, and it's like, is this just another dust storm that we're about to experience? And through comms spits, it's like, nah, weather's good, we're solid for weather. And it's like, well, but however, we're expecting 7th Cav to be on station within the next 15 to 20 minutes. And sure enough, that was the US of A 7th Cavalry. And it's just this, what appeared like a tsunami of mosquitoes turned into like a heavy onset of Apache helicopters, Black Hawks, Chinooks, you name it. They were all coming in to relieve and take over Al-Assad. And that to me was like, that's USA, and that's how they do business. So that was Iraq.
So, mate, we're going to have a quick break in a minute, and then we're going to get into the rest of your career. But what was it like being deployed? Well, you mentioned, it was pretty special, but, Anzac Day, like 1915, you are now, you've been through all the years of history, you've read, you've seen what Anzac Day means. Being on deployment, mate, that one would have been pretty special in the years since you've we've commemorated Anzac Day. That would have been pretty special for you.
Yeah, it was up until that point. What is this? 2003. So, 2000, 2001, 2002. So I've experienced, a single handful of Anzac days in the military, but this was, like you said, I'm an Australian soldier. I'm on operations. I'm not just on operations, but I'm in the global war against terror. And at this point, we were still under the impression that there were weapons of mass destruction. So it was a pretty big deal. And to me, it wasn't just standing next to a flag, with a flame, with a whole bunch of Australian citizens standing around, paying their respects on Australian shores. Like, and I'm not taking away that still is meaningful, but for me, through my lens, being on the other side of the planet, and with the collaboration of not just Australians, the Army, the Air Force, and then we actually had US forces embedded with us with our joint tactical aerial controllers as well. So for them to experience that and kind of feeding off them and their reaction to it, that was like pretty powerful, because it wasn't just us understanding and it being a milestone for us as Australians experiencing Anzac Day on foreign shores, but it was us seeing foreigners, our partners, one of our big brothers, the US, seeing it, how serious we take it, and then their reaction to it, like, oh wow, you guys take this so serious. What is this Anzac Day that means so much to you? And not to go off on a tangent, but mate, even me sitting here tonight, like the average American, they have no idea the contribution that Australians have had to every war that they've set foot on. Like, even, I remember even a couple of days ago, mate. Like, people don't know. People don't know that we are the only country that when they've sounded the trumpet to, hey, we're going to war, Australia are the only ones that have been like, yep, where and when, give us 5 minutes, we'll pack our shit and we're coming with you. So that was instrumental to them. And when you say, hey, man, like, we've always been beside you, like, it's tear jerking material that they see that they see that everything that they've experienced, we've always been there beside them. Whether we are just foot soldiers and we're the ugly stepbrother that really don't have much to give, but what we do, we give 150%. We are with you. That was one of those pieces that I don't think many people understand.
Absolutely, mate. No, yeah, it's pretty, because it's a unique, because a lot of veterans, mate, don't get a chance to deploy on Anzac Day, or and so it's a unique experience. And I wanted to touch on that, why you're right, and being so young too, mate. Like being, as you say, what 20? What were you, 20, 21 at this stage?
So I was 20 by then. I'd finally reached greater than teenage years. I was a 20-year-old.
Mate, I just look at that.
Super humbling.
And yeah, oh mate, I just look at that and I think, like, you've had 2 deployments and you're 20 years old. Like, mate, that just blows my mind, Andy, of that most 20-year-olds, mate, are, getting up to mischief, running around, doing their thing. Mate, you're 20, you've been on 2 deployments overseas, you're banging it in SF world. Mate, like, it's just unbelievable.
Mate, and sorry, just to recirculate on something I wanted to make a comment on before, was kind of resetting the stage of when I was talking about graduating or marching out of Katuka. My parents, my sisters saying, hey, look how much you've changed. When, like I said, I woke up one morning at schoolies and pretty much, high-fived and, slapped, a couple of my mates on the arse and said, hey, boys, I'm off to join the army. Whether they didn't believe me, whatever, I could speculate all day. When I did finally return to Brisbane after, a series of changes in my life, whether it be marching out of, Singleton, finishing selection and getting a bit of time off before I stepped into pre-deployment training, returning from East Timor for post-deployment vacation. Like, when I did pick up the phone and call these guys and go, hey man, let's head on down for, a Tuesday freaking brunch down at the RSL and crack a few beers. Like, those guys weren't just like, Andy, where have you been, mate? But it was a completely different person. And I don't know how they saw me, but the level of maturity that and changes that had taken place without me noticing were completely unexplainable. I don't have the words to articulate the separation between the average, young Australian to what changes that I was making unconsciously, and then to be put back in that, it was a challenge to be able to interact with, and I'm not saying it maliciously, but the infantile and basic thought processes of the average, late teenage year person. And they were things that I was having to navigate, mentally as well. So yeah, there was a lot going on, mate. As a young fella, making all these milestones and kind of not really taking the time to appreciate it.
I think too, mate, what it is you had an accelerated, course in growing up. And, like your 20, mate, most of the civilian population, they do that in, like, it comes in about 26, 27, you're getting it at an accelerated rate, and you're 20 years old. And I think, yeah, like eventually, mate, people catch up, but it just takes, you just had such an accelerated, growth in maturing, and you're around the environment, mate, of older guys. So, as when you're younger, you're around the same age guys, you act to the lowest common denominator is the environment that you surround yourself with.
Yeah, and it's funny, and I scratched my head for years, mate, wondering what that looks like. And eventually, when I speak to the psychs and the think tankers about that, how do I explain that? And just through a sermon that I heard years ago, just put all those pieces into place. And it was like when I finished high school, it was like, hopefully most of the listeners have been to an airport where you've got those big hallways between terminals where you've got the regular walkway and then you've got that escalator escalator where you can step on and, it's moving like a conveyor belt and you're multiplying your speed in opposition to those who are walking on their basic, human skills. That was what happened to me. I finished school, I got on that escalator, and I freaking left those cats in the dust for years. And then finally, these jokers finally caught up, and the amount of experiences that I had endured during that period, were it was just accelerated.
Invaluable, mate, of things that you learn and experiences that you could eventually pass on. And mate, what we're going to do, we're going to have a quick 10-minute break, and then we'll crack on with the next part of your career, mate. And this is where it starts to get hectic, and it's already been hectic, but it gets even more hectic. So, mate, we'll take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back.
Yeah, easy, mate.
So, welcome back to part 2 of our chat with my good mate Andy Steele, and we've just had a quick little short refreshment break, and now we're cracking into the next part of his career. So, Andy, you come back from your trip in 03 from Iraq, a very fulfilling deployment for you, and mate, then 04, you post into Tag East, so your first black role, mate, and you work alongside and meet Ant Plater, Nick Hill, Muzz Turner, Weston Hennessy, and Brett Wood. Mate, talk me through working with some of these legends of the regiment.
Yeah, mate, I'd love to. We get back from the Iraqi. I stayed on a little longer than the main effort. And just for the listener and for more of the nuts and bolts of how the military worked back then, when I served, it isn't just you unplug from operational service, combat operations or operations, however you want to categorize it, and just come back home. All of the equipment that you bring back or you took over, it has to come back. And with the strict quarantine regulations that Australia has, we were strung upon making sure that everything that was brought back complied with regulation. So with that said, for an extra bit of coin, I volunteered to stay back to get that tax-free coin and clean equipment. So there was a component of commandos and SASCAT stayed back in Kuwait, and I can say that because that isn't classified, where all of our equipment was pulled back once I think we were called the Special Operations Task Group back then as well, pulled back, and we stayed there for a month just cleaning trucks, equipment, anything that was to return to Australia, we stayed there and worked on our TANs and got all that stuff cleared up for it to come back to Australia. But the reason why I bring that up is just another one of those realistic expectations, if any of the listeners are interested in the Army, that it's not just all go, 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 squeezing triggers and out doing combat ops. There's a lot of admin that goes into it. So yeah, be prepared for that for anyone that's interested. But it's what you make it. And there's always risk, right? So as we were kind of waving off the lads, the Baddies, the Bergs, Anthony Platter, he was part of that as well. Some key players there. They're all heading back to Australia. We took a separate flight, and this was another chartered flight towards Kuwait. And the flight prior to ours was on what they call an IL-76, which is like an old, at this time it's probably prehistoric now because this was 20 years ago, Russian cargo plane. And the aircraft that the element of Aussies that were flying to Kuwait on, we missed. And fortunately enough, that happened through the grace of God, because that aircraft, mid-flight, the ramp on the back fell off for one reason or another, and the occupants on the plane, other than the pilots and the crew that were in the flight compartment, got sucked out and obviously perished as a result. So we didn't find out about that until a couple of days after, until we pitched a flight on another aircraft that delivered us to Kuwait, and found out that the plane that we were supposed to get, the occupant got sucked out and died. Obviously a horrendous death of falling to their death. But there's always risk there. But that was pretty horrendous to hear about a few days after the event. But fast forwarding from that, the rest of the month of us being in Kuwait was great. We got to enjoy, being off the leash a little bit, and it was also like a bit of a decompression. Not that we saw any hard combat, but it was still just an adjustment phase back into reality, civilization, and getting to experience more of the first world luxuries of the Middle East. And that entailed going out into Kuwait City and enjoying that. But it also allowed us the opportunity to work on our TANs and work in the gym. But for me, one of the big parts of it was rubbing shoulders with regular, conventional coalition forces. And to kind of scale that back, in the special forces community, you're always, I don't want to say confined, the appropriate word would be isolated, maybe, to the regular coalition, whether it be internal, Australian, or foreign, whatever the case may be. So this was the first time that we were out with the rest of the international coalition. And I guess some of the culture that I'd fallen into of more of a relaxed environment tended to pass me unnoticed. So when I fell back into this environment, it kind of shocked me. And the point that I'm talking about is we had mixed showers facilities with the rest of the Americans. And so, nonchalantly, I'm going down to the shower block, and the US are very ordered, policy-driven, standard of practice, uniform specific. That I'm sure they have a full page of the appropriate attire that one would ensure they are wearing when they are embarking on a journey to the shower facility. So Andy Steele is not in compliance with that. So I'm just walking down like a regular Aussie, heading to the showers after a sweaty sesh at the gym. Probably expected to have two thongs on, but in full Andy style, probably you're lucky to have one on. A towel just around my waist, and maybe a tube of toothpaste, a toothbrush, some soap in one hand, and maybe my ID card if you're lucky in the other. And as I'm making my way down, there's these African American females that are walking the opposite direction, and they just have a full-fledged meltdown in US standard issued required shower facility attire, yelling at the top of their lungs to whatever senior rank officer that was off in the distance that this guy is just wearing a towel, in the most southern African American profanity accent you could put on. And I'm pretty much just like, yep, no dramas. Off to the showers, ladies. Have a good one. And needless to say, a couple of days later, whatever it was a warrant officer, a senior NCO from the US, had a whinge to one of our hierarchy saying, hey, you've got one of your soldiers getting around here, or multiple of your soldiers just walking to the shower box, just running a towel. You need to fix it. And I'm pretty sure that whoever it was that got that information stood up for us and said, hey, like that's not something that we worry about. Like, you're going to have to get used to it. Like, that's how Aussies are. We're here to take care of biz. If you want to have a whinge about them, not running the right policy, going to the shower block, you might as well tell your story walking. So that was just one of those, again, acclimatization experiences to dealing with foreign forces, that people, other forces, they don't see things the way you see them. So that was that, mate. But, speeding up a little bit, after that little month of joy of making some coin and insulting the rest of the world, walking around with just a towel. Yeah, got back, took a bit of vacation, did a bit of a Euro trip for a couple of weeks with a couple of lads that I deployed with, and just really used that as a time to decompress, and enjoyed that, but knew full well once I got back to the unit, it was going to be just as high tempo as it was when I left it. So, yeah, I get back, and Flats, like you said, he was in one of the other raid or commando platoons in Iraq. I knew of him, but again, I wasn't intimately involved with him. So you kind of like, you might bow your hat to him at the chow hall. I know he was a bit of a recon guru from one of the northern battalions. So I knew that, he knew what he was on about. But this was where I got to get more of an intimate relationship with him when we got back from Iraq and we did our advanced close quarter battle course, which is the course that is the initial migration into the Tactical Assault Group, which was now founded as the Tactical Assault Group East. So, yeah, got to know Platts, and like in true fashion, knew that he was experienced, kind of taking Dan Fortune's lingo. He knew what good looked like. So I made sure that I was very close to his belt buckle to emulate his actions as we went down that rabbit hole. With that said, H, of course, he was one of the ringleaders on that, probably the senior instructor, no doubt. Knew him. I knew the aura of H. He was one of the old school Bravo guys. He was prestigious within the recon community in the northern battalions. He was one of the original plank holders for the unit, if you will. So yep, starting to rub shoulders with H, and then Nick Hill as well, old school Bravo icon that I knew of, but just hadn't crossed paths with. And like you said, Muzz Turner, knew him, but same still, he was just another fancy face that had experience and one of the icons in the unit that I saw in the chow hall, and started to get to know him through that course. Brett Woodrow, he was in amongst that as well as a director staff. He was in Iraq as well, but same as Platts, just on that peripheral edge of not part of my outfit. So I knew who he was. I knew the aura that he had, but I still hadn't had that opportunity to work with him intimately. But this is where that started to migrate. So that that course was tough. Another death of just a hose at full capacity, knowing your background, just drinking out of a fire hose, mate. So that was a lot for me to take on. Just a completely different dynamic. You have those soldierly skills, but this takes it to the next level of precision shooting, close quarter battle, initiative tactics, situational awareness, and that was, really good. But with that said, it was testament to the instructors that I had and the peers that I had that were around me that helped me get through that. And back then, that was when part of the course was done at Holsworthy Barracks in Sydney. But let me get the acronym right, the Special Forces Training Facility, SFTF, at Holsworthy hadn't been built yet. So the second portion, if you were successful of being selected or acquiring the necessary skills, you would then fly to Perth and use their kill house or shoot house to conclude that course. So that was back in those days. But yeah, that was a big one for me to get that one. And then that was where I was starting to get influenced by that wording of daily renewable contract, force of last resort, no fail, tasking, and really starting to work around those high profile operators like the guys I just spoke about. But that was about the time where I'm just I'm going to say it, leave one of them out of it, because I don't know whether he's open to open source public recognition, but there was a word that described H, Nick Hill, and fill in the blank someone else, as they were, again, old school Bravo. They were the original plank holders. They were the original of the tag. So they were very much so like the standard bearers of that pedigree of operator. And for us who were at the lower ranks that hadn't reached that yet, we'd given them the names of lemon, lime, and bitters, because they were very matter of fact, cold-blooded, and as it says, they were sour individuals if you were to cross them on the wrong terms. So yeah, shout out to H. God bless you, Nick, and that individual that I'm not talking about. You know who you are. You know exactly what I'm talking about. But yeah, that was where that came in. That course, I broke my right wrist falling off the back of an aircraft mock-up, live fire mock-up over there. Didn't know about that until 2 weeks later, probably by design, because after experiencing that 3 days short of the end of the course and how grueling it is, like I didn't want to go through it again. So I kind of kept that to myself, and really didn't let the medics look at it in a in an appropriate light that would make a diagnosis such as you broke your wrist until I had finished the course. So those last 3 days were pretty painful, running around, throwing flashbangs and everything else. But yeah, I did what I had to do.
As you mentioned, mate, like I've had Ant on the podcast, I've had Muzz on the podcast, and as you mentioned, I had the late, Nick Hill, who was a great mate of mine. Tragically, he was killed last year in the US, as you know. And mate, these are all, and I've heard so much about Brett Wood, and tragically, Brett would be killed on operations in Afghanistan, which we'll talk about later on, and how that affected you. But, mate, I think, like you mentioned all these names, mate, these were the names that were starting to be, that become household names in Two Commando.
100%. 100%.
And for you, mate, working alongside these operators, like they would have made you become a better operator in your own right.
Oh, Adam, without a doubt. It's like, as I've gotten to the age of where I'm at, you look at a child and you can critique a child however you will, but there's a big part of that child that their molding is from their parent. And with that shape of definition, that is kind of where I put, those guys in my molding, not just as a professional soldier, but as a man, as a warrior, and whether they knew it or not. And this is a good platform to express that to them, because I never got the chance to express it. That's what they did, whether it was their intent or not, whether it was just about the product of the capability of the nation, ensuring that they had the best people on the team, making sure that they had the best gunfighters to the left and right. Like that's what they were to me. Like it was through them, their parenting, their soldierly skills that I emulated or faked until I made it, that made me the operator that I finally became.
So I want to touch on that, mate, because for you, tag was you guys trickle feeded in then, didn't you? It wasn't company based. It was you trickle fed into that in those days, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah, it was individual. You take a handful of guys, and it would be a very slow, progressive makeup within whatever unique role that you fulfilled within the tag. And the tag back then, that was called Charlie Company. Once we returned from East Timor, I want to say the Charlie Company that I was deployed with essentially disbanded. And after that, battalion, what they call them, reduced activity period of guys going on post-war, post-deployment vacation, we came back, the tag was stood up, and the tag was now called Charlie Company. And that's where, the big aura of Charlie Company became apparent. And in order for you to go up to, back to Luscombe, out the back as it was called, you were going to Charlie Company, you're going to Tag East. And in order for that to happen, it was a trickle. And with that said, I think the unique part of that was because the Tag East was so unique back then. We still had SASCATs, so we still had SAS regiment guys that were still holding key appointments within the Tag East. at certain capacities until maybe it was at the unit level, whether it was at the SAS command level, whether it was at the special operations command level, whether it was at the government political level, that they felt, hey, these commandos, they are good to go. You can drop the mic, you can step out of the arena. They're clear hot to fight on their own. So there was that portion as well of that transition from us being let off the leash to run our own show as well. And without saying it, I'm sure that there was a lot of credibility, expectation that had to have been met in order for those guys to, put their stamp of approval on it and say, hey, to the nation, these guys are capable to be the force of last resort.
So on that, mate, I want to touch on for you, like the green role to the black role. It's very different. And is it the hardest part for you? Was it the room to combat phase of was that the hardest part, and like the shooting and doing all what you got to do? Talk me through the difference in the two roles.
Yeah. So let me unpack that a bit. The intensity of tag up until this point was like nothing I'd experienced. The precision shooting, I mean, you go through Kapuka, you've got to meet the demands of Kapuka standard. You go through Singo, you've got to meet the demands of the infantry soldier standard. You've got at that point in time, the commando, shooting standard. But then, even like Dan Fortune said way back when the SAS stood up the tag, it was a trickle system way back then, and you had to do like really another selection to go on black roll or tag over there. It's just another huge step up, and I don't want to say that I have to kind of answer this very delicately. The risk of life, the care of life domestically is more important to the care of life overseas. But your shooting needs to be A1 spec. Like there is no missed shot. There's no, hey man, like that's a bad shot. There is none of that. It's like, man, you need to be slapping rounds center of the forehead, neutralizing hostages like the click of a finger. So that amount of precision and expertise is required. And it's the speed, the surprise, the violence of action in order to do that, to execute those kind of operations. Like there is no time for, thinking about what needs to be done. Like when it's time to go, it's time to go. And everything up to, trigger release, sending that trigger, putting that trajectory through the air into someone's head. Like there's everything up to that point needs to be precise as well. So, you've got those elements of precision driving where you've got guys that come in, they're, race car drivers that teach you how to throw around at that point a Nissan Patrol that's got racks on it, gizmoed up for military precision. Then it went to the Toyota Land Cruiser that was the 200 series that you're driving a very capable, probably the number one capable off-road driving platform in the world, but now you're driving it like a performance vehicle, around a, Indy 500 track to be able to get that job done. You've got breaches, explosive experts that it doesn't matter what kind of compound, building, facility that you are faced with, your job within that team is to guarantee no matter what. Like, there is no, hey, what if this doesn't happen? Like, you need to be able to precisely guarantee entry, whether it be explosively, ballistically, firmly, whatever the case may be. You as an individual, and when I say as an individual, 9 times out of 10, this is a private. Like, you're dealing with a private or a trooper if you're in the regiment. And there's a lot of responsibility for that individual. And, for me, what am I now? I'm 21, 22. Like, that's a lot of responsibility. And, Nick, I put Nick, and probably H as well. He probably threw this around a lot on the range as well. He's like, if you are one of these guys, you need to acknowledge the fact that you've pretty much told John Howard at the time that you guarantee to get that vehicle to the compound, to the stronghold. If you are the method of entry expert, you are guaranteeing not just John Howard, but the rest of Australia that the charge that you set on that building will explode, and the guys that are standing behind you are going to get into that room, building, whatever, and neutralize the threat to reduce the risk of, injury or death of innocent civilians. So there's a lot of that going on. And like, with all of that put on you on a daily basis, the daily renewable contract, that intensity, the call out procedures, like, you're on call all the time. You need to be able to be reachable, receivable, and be able to respond, to work, to be able to mount up and go to, an airfield, airbase, whatever, to be able to deploy to anywhere around Australia to be able to interdict, a terrorist action. It's a lot there. So that's the kind of stuff that you're doing. But when you're exposed to it for so long, I say this now, it just became your new ordinary. That extraordinary became just your regular pattern of life, where you are so used to running at, 6,000 revs per minute that 6,000 revs per minute just becomes your regular first gear. So you're so revved up and cashed in all the time that it just becomes ordinary. And I think that was the big thing. And even though you're not offshore operational, you are onshore operational. So you're always ready to deploy with live guns, live charges, live everything. Like, lives depend on your individual actions, and you're always ready to go. So that intensity, it really speaks volumes, and I've never experienced that anywhere else in the world. And then you've got all the enablers, right? So you've not just got that at the individual level that's expected from the lowest common denominator, like me as a private in the tag, but you've got all of those ranks that are going up from, your second in command in the team, your team commander, the patrol commanders, all the way up. So you've got all those responsibilities that are all expected, that if you don't do your job right, like, hey man, maybe this is not for you. Like, you're not suitable. Like, you've hit your threshold. You're no longer presenting or providing the A game. Like, that filter system, like, maybe we need to find you something else where, you can chill out for a while. And, you maybe injuries, maybe, people have got personal issues with family, whatever the case may be. Like, you need to be able to turn up to work every single day, ready for it to be your Super Bowl. So there was that. And then you've got, all of the enablers. So you've got the aviation asset. Back then it was 5 Aviation. They were the freaking 1/60th special aviation service, equivalent to America here, like the Night Stalkers. Like, they knew how to run precision operations and put those Blackhawks in places that most aviators didn't know how, under NVG, in very difficult conditions, first time every time. So, like, you've got all of that. So it's such a migrated experience where everyone that you're working with is like the best of the best, and you're expecting that from them, and they're expecting that from you. So with all that said, mate, I'll take a breath. Um, you do that, and then the question that you ask is, what's the difference, or what's the off ramp back to green roll? Um, the pathway is when you go back to green roll, like you've been exposed to all of this high energy, intensive precision, that you are such a sharp bladed instrument that when and if you deploy on green roll operations, which at this point was Afghanistan, you're ready to launch. But the big difference is, and I didn't know this at the time until I stepped into Afghanistan, but the time critical piece, that's the part that is different. That war roll stuff, it isn't saving the lives of the hostages anymore. It's more war rolls. You're disrupting, you're fighting for information. It's more strategic. So you have a little bit more time to be more crafty with your approach, if that makes sense. It's not as time sensitive in the fact that it is when it's that black roll.
Hmm. And I suppose for you, mate, you'd come a long way where East Timor, putting to where you were to on tag, and you finish your time in, like, you pass that course, and then in 2005, mate, you become a land platoon. You jump on land platoon. What was that like for you?
Yeah, so winding back a bit, when I started my journey, I read books about feel the fear and do it anyway. I don't remember the author, but that was pretty pivotal. A poem, Winners Take Chances. It was a poem, I can't remember the author, but it was a poem that was written, and it was a game changer for David Campese when he was, an icon in the Australian rugby world at the point in time. And it really changed his perspective when he was having some issues with his career. So there was a lot of that sort of stuff that, I really plugged in on, purpose-driven life books, that kind of stuff was a lot of stuff where it was like mind molding. And that a lot of that with a combination of all that, that's where I came up with that motto of like, fake it till you make it. And the reason why I bring that up is when I finally got to the tag and went to land platoon as a MOE operator, I kind of I put that saying, that motto, that verbiage up on the mantle, and I was like, I truly feel like I don't have to fake it anymore. I have actually made it. I feel comfortable standing next to the H's, the Nick Hills, the Muzz Turners, the Ant Platters, the Brett Woods, and I may not be exactly on their level, but I feel like I can stand next to them and be worthy of, that, that peripheral aura, if you will, and be able to perform with guys such as that, if that makes sense. So that was my intellectual, psychological mindset once I got to that. And yeah, with that said, when it did, at that point in time, I didn't know when I'd be cycling off the tag, but I truly actually felt like I was capable of entering any domain on the world's status and be an effective operator.
So you finish your, you get on to tag, and as you mentioned, as you've said, you felt like you'd finally made it and you could stand on your own 2 feet. As you've been humble the whole time, mate, that we've been talking. But 2006, the Commonwealth Games happened. Talk me through this.
So that was another privilege, right? I'd climbed that mountain. I'd worked on any of those weaknesses. I'd put the fake it till you make it up on the mantle. I felt like I was conditioned to operate with the best. 2006 Melbourne Commonwealth Games, Tag East is tasked with exactly what Tag West back then, SAS 3 Squadron, were tasked with for the Olympic Games in Sydney. So it was really like reaching that point where I felt like I'd reached the place that I originally was inspired to get to when I saw those guys flying around in Black Hawks with feet dangling out, heading into the city centre. So that was where I was with that, and it was really a good opportunity for me to look back and see, okay, the last time we did this, I was on out of Corden. This hit out, it's been 6 years. Now I'm on the other end of this spectrum. So that was pretty blood rushing. And the opportunities to just continue to hone those skills for the unit and the culture and what do I say, the pace of the unit, like that right there was another culminating opportunity for Tag East to prove to the nation that we could do the same, if not more, than what Tag West was doing. So we were doing training serials, not just for the resolution of counterterrorism on the ground in Australia, but then it was starting to work into special recovery offshore. So within the parameters of Australia, if there's any issues, and ship underway. So if you've got pirating activities, terrorist activities, whatever the case may be, offshore, the Tag being able to effectively respond and neutralise or create a resolution for whatever that is, with a ship underway at sea. So there was a lot of those evaluations and assessments that were getting signed off on that were going on behind the scenes as well. And to contribute to that was pretty comforting as well. Like, you are an individual, you might be just a single raindrop in the ocean, but if that raindrop becomes like a strategic raindrop and it's pollutant to the rest of the ocean, then the rest of the ocean is toxic. So, looking at it through that perspective, like I truly felt at that point that I was starting to contribute to the main effort of Australia's defence,
And
which was rewarding.
sorry to cut you off there. In that same year, Bergs and Brett deployed they're in Afghanistan, so things are starting to heat up in Afghanistan. Rotation 3, and mate, you're hearing, as you said, you're on Tag. You're hearing back at the regiment. The guys are getting into DA Nile, Op Perth, mate. Talk me through that, and what was that like? You being on Tag. Was that, and talk me through some of those stories that you were hearing of the guys on rotation 3.
Yeah, mate. So with as an individual, I'm super highly focused on my role in Melbourne in the Tag, and we've got a lot of eyes on us, not just domestically but internationally. I met Condoleezza Rice on that gig. We had a lot of oversight or observations. We had DevGru, Navy SEAL Team 6 guys coming and observing. Obviously, they probably were part and involved with the protection for Condoleezza Rice. We had Delta or Combat Application Groups guys, Tier 1 assets from the US coming over. Probably the same thing, just seeing who's who in the zoo within certain parts of the world that are providing capabilities, seeing what's going on. And it was through that, and obviously through our own information that was being fed down the chain of command within defence, that our partners, brothers in arms, fellow operators from the unit were, on war rolls, green rolls, if you will, over in Afghanistan. And, like I said, we thought we were the ones that were killing it, taking the domestic counterterrorism capability operational. But, with that information starting to be revealed and hearing the after action reports and the whispers of the actual operations, and now they've transferred from operations to kinetic operations in Afghanistan. Yeah, it was a game changer, mate. For me, starting to hear that guys are, pulling jobs over there, getting in serious gunfights, long-winded gunfights that needed to be suppressed by aerial asset, kicking asses and taking names, like, legitimately now. Like, it was like starting to not just be heard, through the rumor mill of, the soldier network domestically through the Australian Army, but you're starting to hear it from, other partnering coalition forces like the SEALs, the CAG, saying, "Hey man, like, what are you guys doing over there? Like, you guys are starting to really push, the networks up against the wall." We heard that, the Canadians were in the shit, and you guys went in and, solved freaking problems. Who are you guys? Like, I need to get my notebook and pen out and ask, like, what unit are you guys from? So it wasn't just over there, and I can't speak for what was happening over there at the time, at that time. But for me, on the handlebars back in Australia, you could hear not just from the Australian perspective, but, the US perspective of, wow, like, you guys are really starting to step into the arena of warfighting on the international stage, which was inspiring to us. And, for us, that were there, we were super focused on the job and the task at hand. But then now, we're starting to get, itchy trigger fingers ourselves, saying, "Hey man, I don't want to be on black rolls anymore. I want to go and join the fight with Woodrow and Bergs and the rest of the lads that are freaking getting amongst it OS overseas."
So I want to touch on something too, like the guys are over there, but mate, I want to touch on a rescue. You were part of a rescue of the Holt family, mate. Can you talk to me about this rescue?
Oh yeah. So got back from the Olympics in Melbourne, and I've mysteriously found myself in that opportunity or recognised position for promotion. Get back and join Beatty and a few other good dudes, and find ourselves up on a promotion course in Singleton. And we've been up there for a couple of weeks, and myself and one of the SAS guys that was over doing the promotion course with us, and one of the other commando cats that I was with, we were driving back just see the family, get back to Sydney for the weekend. And it was during one of those wet seasons up near Newcastle, and so we're driving along the highway, and thinking nothing of it. Pretty dizzy little rainfall, not a big deal. Starts to get pretty hard. And whoever it was that was driving was like, bad drills, mate. You didn't prep the tank yesterday. We're running short on gas. We're going to have to pull over onto one of these sketchy side off ramps and gas up. So we've done that. And as we're getting off the off ramp, regular pattern of life starting to change. And you can start to see the brake lights of the vehicles in front of us. You can start to see a tractor trailer, stopping, coming to a complete stop. And, we're stationary for a minute, just assessing the scene, as I'm sure you guys are well aware of, that kind of lingo. And, we're like just shaking our heads going, man, like, this doesn't feel right. Like, what's going on? What's the drama? So, we kind of pull off onto the shoulder of the road, and all three of us just run on down, because you can, start to see a bit of distress of the guy that was driving the truck. And as we're kind of closing in, he's, broken, very distressed, saying, oh, there's a car that just flew off the road. So, we're trying to fight for a bit of info, getting our way down. And as we start to close closer and closer and closer to the scene, you can see that the road has just collapsed, and there's like a culvert that has just imploded, and the water's just been so overpowering that it's just pulled away a significant part of the road. And we've like started to run down the embankment, and as the foliage starts to clear, you can see a white vehicle that's just in the rush of the river, and the water that's just rushing. And you see this bloke that's being pinned between the body of the vehicle and the passenger side door. And we start getting a bit of a narrative going, hey mate, like, can you open the door? And it's like, no. And we start getting it all going. And long story short, he couldn't give two rats asses about himself. He's like, oh, my kids and my missus are in the car, so we're doing the best we can. And as this is all going on, finally, the truck drivers come down, and we're like, mate, have you got any AD straps or any straps that we could use? Because we need to get this guy a lifeline, a rescue line, to get out to get a hold of him. And, finally he gets all this going, and, myself and the other bloke, we're doing the best we can to get this guy into a, like a cow loop to pull him out, tying it around a tree. But regardless of the efforts that we were working on, the water that was continuing to accumulate was just getting so powerful that it finally just pushed the car off down the river. He did finally get the rope, but he just couldn't get a hold of it. So that was pretty untidy. That progressed to myself and the rest of the guys running down the side of the stream, river, the rapids and whatever else, until we found the vehicle that was posted up on like a higher piece of ground. And one of the blokes that I was with, he went down with hypothermia. I didn't know that until later on. And then the other bloke got caught up and was essentially temporarily detained by a police officer that said that you're part of a crime scene, and whatever the case may be. So that kind of left me on my own to go and assess the vehicle. And very tragically, I cleared the vehicle that none of the occupants were left in it. Which was pretty tragically, and later on we found out that they were all washed out and drowned, unfortunately, in the dam far below. But that was my first clash, and it wasn't on the military stage of death. Super close hand. It was the first clash of death that my actions may or may not have had a direct involvement in the outcome. So there was a lot of soul searching post that. And just to cover off on that very briefly, there was a lot of disappointment in the regular community, the regular. And, it is what it is. So if I offend people in the community, I don't apologize for that. Maybe it'll tell people to wake up and do what they need to in the event that it's your time to shine. But I was very disappointed at the lack of, what would I say, willingness to assist in a situation like that. And Adam, mate, I'm sure that you can understand that more than I have, and have probably got more events to express that, and maybe some ways to deal with that. But yeah, that really left a real dark cloud over me on the general public, and kind of left me pretty pissed off. And the what ifs started to come into it on, had we have done this, had we have done that, had this person been able to do what I asked them to do, that kind of played out. So yeah, that was, the unfortunate events with the Holt family that played out. We all got a civilian bravery commendation for that, but that to me, I really didn't feel worthy of it, because I really didn't set out and achieve the mission the way I intended. And there was some mental conflict between, what I'd been providing to the nation and being this guy that can operate and be relied upon to rescue, this, that, and the other. And then now I'm confronted with a situation. So, I had to start to deal with, some things that are beyond my control. So yeah, that kind of left me in a dark place for a little while. And yeah, I kind of had to work through that, which I'm sure, you can express your own experiences with that too, mate.
Yeah, it's interesting that, and mate, like, as I say, you did what you're trained to do, and what we do as first responders. You see the threat, you assess it, and you make that decision. And some people, and I'll say it too, some civilians, that when they're exposed to that, it's like they freeze, and they don't actually know what to do, or they can't do it. And it's just the training that you and I have, that you make that decision, and you go for it. And it's, I don't take anything away from some people. Some people, it's just beyond their capabilities of, they just and sometimes, I can say it, mate, they're more a hindrance than they are, that they actually hinder the overall mission of the success of a mission, and of rescuing someone, or doing the task at hand. So but yeah, it is, mate, as I say to you, like, what you did, mate, was, tragically, they passed away. And as you said, it was the first time for you dealing with death, and for something that was out of your control. And how is the unit towards you? Like, did they get around you and really support you in that?
You know what? They did, mate. Post event, incident, however you want to shape that, we got interviewed by the law enforcement, the regional law enforcement, on actions and so on and so forth. I expressed my concerns about one of the guys being temporarily detained by what I expressed as a poor the experienced officer. I expressed my frustrations on some of the police officers that really didn't do anything while we were trying to take initiative, and they, like you said, they were getting in the way. And there was a point where one of the police officers were telling me to stop and come back up to the road after the vehicle had started to make its way further down. And I was like, pretty much, F your eyes, like, there's lives on the line. Like, you either shoot me or let me go. So anyway, I digress. After all that, we finished our promotion course a couple of weeks later, and even before the course had finished, the chaplain at the School of Infantry up at Singleton, he actually came and spoke to us while we were still on the course, and said, "Hey, we've heard what happened. If you guys got any issues, we can make arrangements to step you out of the course." and make ourselves available to talk to you. And we just want to be available for you if you need to have anyone to chat about, or and so on and so forth. So not just the unit, but the wider army, they were very supportive with us. And then when we did get back to the unit, the unit site team, they were very instrumental in the pathway of mental healing, I guess I could say. And they helped, or the psych at the time, he helped me join the dots and come to terms with exactly what you're saying, mate. Like I said, there was that dark cloud over me about being pissed off about the regular population not willing to do anything. He gave me a lot of current content, articles, lessons learnt, studies on same incidences, and he's like, this is the psyche of the human being. He expressed to me the fight, flight, freeze response that's very common to the human, and that kind of gave me an understanding, and he gave me the pathways of, hey, like you are conditioned to this, you've been trained. It's not that you don't. It's not like you don't have an unhealthy respect of fear, but you have experienced your abilities and limitations, and you are more in control than the average person, and you're willing to do more than most. So there was a lot of that stuff, mate, that they explained to me, which was very helpful, and kind of just, it was a double-edged sword, because it didn't just help me deal with it and rationalize and come to terms with it, but I want to be kind of honest and maybe a little bit vulnerable in saying that in a dark way, this was maybe a point in my personality that created, I don't want to say, because I think it's a little bit strong, a God complex, but it gave me a separation to the regular human habitat. And I don't know whether that sounds a little bit too strong, but
No.
it makes me feel like, hey, you know what? I'm not like the rest of the herd. I'm like one of these unique ones that is more capable than the rest, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, mate.
A little bit toxic, and I think now that I'm a little bit older, it might have put me in a headspace that thought that I was a little bit greater than most, but that, I think, kind of fueled that and put me on a pathway of being unique among others.
Absolutely, mate. No, I totally get it. I absolutely get it, and I think it's something that civilians have it, but I'm using my words very I'm watching what I say here, because you and I are still civilians, but we just have a different set of skills and training, and to that civilians you and I, and like I say, veterans and first responders are faced with these situations on a more regular basis than the average civilian is. And I think I've answered that and broken it down in the context of trying not to say that we're better than them, but that we're just trained differently, and we're exposed to these situations a lot more than what the standard civilian is.
Yeah, I think maybe just to maybe make it a little bit more digestible, is it's the conditioning, mate. It's the conditioning that we're exposed to. It's through no fault of those that haven't.
Correct.
If that,
absolutely, absolutely. And So that happens, mate, and then you finish your promotion course, and then you were part of so you post into recon platoon, and this is where you meet another iconic guy in the regiment who tragically lost his life in 2011, along in the same period of when Woodrow was lost. Todd Langley, mate, what do you remember of Todd, and what was it like serving alongside Todd?
Oh, mate, good one. Todd, this was unlike the rest of the lads. He was fresh to the unit. So I didn't have that, at a distance aura of reputation that I was exposed to with the rest of the boys that I've spoken about. So Todd, when I posted into recon platoon, he was a very loud, likable personality and a master of his craft. I had just come off black roll, so there was that period where I'm just trying to regain my footing in green roll. I've been, supercharged. I've been on, the battery freaking power up for a while now, and now I'm trying to find, my groove back to green roll. And Todd was one of the patrol commanders in recon platoon, as it was called back then. I think he was one of the sniper gurus. And in true Andy form, I saw it. I did my own, secret homework on, like, who's this guy? Is he good to go? Is he all talk? Is he just a shiny car that doesn't have an engine? And they're like, no, man, this dude's one of the Northern Battalion guys. He's good to go. I think Ian Langers said that he was in his platoon way back when. I've only got that information now since listening to Ian, but so that's the kind of guy that I'm dealing with. So yeah, I'm like verified, trust but verify, confirmed. This guy is again one of those guys that I'm going to grab by the belt buckle, and I'm going to grab as much good tool and skill out of this guy that I can, and he provided that. He was the kind of guy that he was kind of standoffish, probably doing the same thing that I was doing on him. Like, who's this freaking young pup piece of shit, Andy Steele? Is he good to go? Is he worth my time? Am I going to freaking spit in his coffee, or am I going to freaking, wipe my ass with his cigarettes, or whatever the case may be? But, finally we got to that point where, we could share a brew. And, that was one of those things about Todd was, he had an art to just be able to find hot, fresh coffee, whether it was in the patrol office, up in one of the raid platoons, up at the headquarters. Like this just didn't extend from, at barracks at home in Australia. This was like in the Badlands in Afghanistan. If you're in a platoon harbour, out in the middle of nowhere, he will find someone that's got hot, fresh coffee. So, that kind of guy. And he was good about finding the good in the lows and finding the lows in the highs, just to keep you, even keel. Very specific about his kit. Loved his equipment. A few other guys that are out there that may not listen to this, there was people in the unit that were very equipment orientated. So where if the military didn't provide you the equipment, they go out and spend their own money on the latest and greatest polished fancy equipment. And, Todd was one of those. So when I rolled up into, recon platoon, he's busting my balls about, hey man, like, is that issued kit? And it's like, yeah, man, just came off team. This is what they give us. And it's like, oh, you're a piece of shit. You're a freaking vermin, man. Like, you need to go out and buy yourself some of the latest and greatest equipment. Because if you don't, you're going to be dragging ass. And so that was the kind of guy. And he always seemed to find himself in the center of action, whether it was on an exercise or whether later on down the track, just through his later on life, like he had a way of being at the center and knowing exactly what was going on. On those operations, troops in contact. I reminded, that was like the formal saying, on the world spectrum, global war against terror, whether it spanned back to Vietnam, I don't know. But troops in contact was, guys that are getting in amongst it with the freaking insurgency network. Yeah, no, that changed to Todd in contact, because any time that troops were in contact, Todd was involved. He was very good at sniffing his way into contact and getting amongst it. So yeah, that was freaking Toddy. Super freaking funny. He has an ability to make the insurgency, and I'll get into this later on how we did things when we were overseas, but he had a natural ability to antagonize the enemy, to pop their head above the threshold, where most people had struggled to do that. Todd could. Wherever he went, he would find himself in contact. And that was the unique thing about Todd. Like, he could do that. So if you wanted to get into a gunfight, you got to be hanging around Todd. And, spanning back to, when I first met him, he was like Nick, but bigger, broader. Nick. He's more like the rest of us. Thought he was a bit of more of a biggin kid, and he could smash coffee, probably get on the cans the night before, and when there was a commando fitness test the next day, he didn't have the washboard stomach and the freaking bicep bulging and the quadriceps flexing out of his PT shorts. But, he's the guy that would turn up in like a shitty pair of freaking Dunlop volleys or KT-26s from, standard issue Kapuka 25 years ago and like nail the PT sesh to the wall. While the rest of us guys that take our PT training pretty seriously are struggling. And, he'd be at the finish line going, what's the drama, boys? What's the issue? So, that was Todd, mate. In a nutshell.
Mate, just hearing that, and as you mentioned, Langers spoke very, very highly of Todd and actually dedicated his PhD to Todd, which that was something that I didn't know. And just hearing Langers speak of him, mate, and hearing you, and I've spoken to a lot of other guys that, I've spoken to a lot of operators in the unit now, and mate, these guys, like, these names are, like, they're iconic, mate. Like Woodrow and Todd and, mate, like so many other guys, Cam, and mate, we could go on forever listing the names, but mate, these guys, they're iconic to the regiment.
Yeah, to me, and not going off on too much of a tangent, mate, but we're in this generation of Marvel comics and Hollywood movies where you've got all these pretenders that fill the shoes of these fictitious characters. These are the guys, man, from Australia that no one knows about. That if you got the likes of Mel Gibson and the rest of those hunters that are in that community to sit down and listen to some of this stuff, this is where those myths and icons come from, but have the Australian twist to it, where there's that stigma around it that people just turn their ears up and go, that's Australian. That is genuine Australian Anzac individual personality.
Absolutely. And mate, as it is, like, recording these stories, mate, it's for the future generations to remember these guys and know that, know some of the stories. And as you say, mate, and we've spoken off air, mate, you were what an absolute privilege and an honour to serve with these guys.
Yeah, and the more that I live life day on after service, that honor and privilege and appreciation intensifies, because at the time I was surrounded by such high performers that, like I said, I just thought it was ordinary. And for people that I know and I rub shoulders with now on a daily basis, it's no kick in your face to you, but I took it for granted that I was around. I was sitting on the shoulders of these guys that just aren't normal. Like, you don't, most people globally, I'm not just going to reduce this to Australia, most people don't get to experience these kind of individuals or the actions or events that they actually live. So, yeah, man, like you said, mate, a privilege, and that word itself just doesn't give it justice.
Absolutely. No, 100%, mate. Rest in peace, all those brave warriors, mate. These, the hard hitters, mate, that you fought with, but mate, let's talk about it now. Your first trip to Afghanistan. Let's talk about this. Finally, you're in country, mate. After you've deployed to East Timor, you've deployed to Iraq. These are all stepping stones. It's all building up. You're on CT, and mate, talk me through this first trip.
That was part 1 of our 2-part episode. Join us next week for part 2 of former Special Forces 2nd Commando veteran Andy Steele.
Raise your glasses, podcasters. This episode of True Blue Conversations is brought to you by Wet Canteen Bottling Company, the perfect way to commemorate and celebrate life's most special occasions. Elevate your moments, savour the taste, and make them truly unforgettable with Wet Canteen. Head on over to wetcanteenbottlingco.com.au and use the code TRUEBLUE for your exclusive discount. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of True Blue Conversations with your host, Adam Bloom. See you on the front line.